from my end, yes, okay. So we will go into paper presentation, and each paper presentation has one discussant. Other than Caroline Caudry, who have put too much on today, she'll be discussing two papers. So it's going to be, I'll introduce the presenter, and afterwards the discussant can have about 10 minutes to sort of give feedback about the paper and some thoughts. So generally, what we have in mind is an opportunity to see that there are 7 papers being presented today, and with the support of the editors, we have agreed to get at least some sort of mentorship and, in fact, opportunity for collaboration, even in the area of, I'll put it in this way, co-authorship for papers that, potentials exist, but, where the skill and experience is not sufficient to get it through. So in the end, it's really to give the papers the right opportunity to get published. That's the goal. If our participants today are able to walk through and do all the hard work it entails, I think to a reasonable degree that there is an opportunity for those papers to sort of eventually get through. But that will be something that will come through the hard work that is required to get it done. And certainly saying that it's not just going to be an easy process, but it's worth investing in. So for the first presentation, we have this first segment, we have 2 full papers that were submitted, and all the other papers are more at this stage of proposal, and it's deliberate that we've asked for proposals. The reason is we think it's also a good opportunity for contributing authors to get an opportunity to either reshape it or put it in a position that really would suit what we are looking for. But that said, there are people who already have finished product, and we're happy with that. So there are 2 papers that are pretty much in their first full draft, and that will be the first segment of the presentation. And the first one is going to be on costs price disclosure for colonial forced labor, the case of rubber exploitation in French Equatorial African concession. And this is a historical account of the periods of 1899 to 1945. Anthony and Perry are the authors here. So, Anthony, are you the one presenting?
Yes. Hello, everyone.
Will you present in English or French?
English. I can present in English.
Okay, excellent. So, okay, go for it.
Okay, I will.
Let me see if you can share the screen. Otherwise, yes. I will make you a cool.
Yes, I will.
Can you share?
Of this one. Okay.
Excellent.
So, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I will start. Hello, everyone. So this paper is about a project conducted with Pierre Labardin entitled Cost Price Disclosure for Colonial Forced Labor, the case of the rubber exploitation in French Equatorial Africa. This presentation is a result of a first exploratory study and will be complemented by more substantial work in the archives. We study accounting disclosure practices from colonial companies in French Equatorial Africa in the early 20th century. This colony was organized around a concessionary regime based on ivory trading and exploitation of rubber extracted by local populations. In a context of collapsing rubber world prices, partly linked to the rise of the rubber plantation in Southeast Asia, we noted the importance of cost price calculation and its disclosure to assess profitability of rubber companies. Here, we want to explore the rhetorical function of cost price disclosure, focusing on its articulation with the imposition of forced labor regime by colonial administration through capitation tax. This first empirical investigation led us to formulate a preliminary reflections on the links between accounting, forced labor, and the historical dynamics of capitalism. We propose here to understand capitalism through the dual process of commodification and decommodification of labor, enabling the link to be made with various forced labor regimes and to highlight the role of accounting in this respect. The existing link between accounting and development of capitalism have been highlighted by accounting scholars. For example, we can refer to the Sombard's argument about the development of double entry, the Breuer's analysis about calculation of profit and profitability, or the argument of Richard about valuation of assets. Here, we want to study the case of costing practices, which seems to be relatively little considered by this literature. To this end, we refer to the insights from the recent historiographic trend of the new history of capitalism, mainly based on studies on slavery in antebellum South of United States. This historiographic trend reconsiders the opposition between forced labor and free labor in the rise of capitalism. In this perspective, various forms of forced labor are analyzed as the origin of a first form of capital accumulation. In this work, we adopt this perspective, focusing more specifically on the definition of capitalism provided by Rosenthal and centered around the power of commodification of labor by capitalists. In her definition, Rosenthal considers the power to commodify labor to be an essential component of capitalism. A capitalist regime is thus characterized by a situation where capitalists have the power to insert labor into market mechanisms that make it a commodity like any other. Rosenthal's definition also highlights the fact that this commodification movement is not unilateral. Depending on the evolution of their interests, capitalists have also the ability to establish a reverse movement of decommodification of labor. Such a definition thus underlines the central function of calculation instruments like accounting in their commodification and decommodification dynamics. From this point, we situate our work at the intersection of two literatures in accounting history. First, it complements research about colonial companies' financial reporting and narrative accounting disclosures. Here, financial reporting is understood as a software of imperialism. Narrative accounting disclosures constitutes rhetorical resources to justify domination and exploitation of local population by colonialists. As a means of concealing the darker and more violent aspects of colonial domination, accounting narrative disclosures make colonial companies accountable to shareholders and or government authorities and constitutes a means of attracting new investors. Our research adds to this trend by focusing on cost price disclosures and information generally kept secret by companies, and by showing how accounting narrative disclosures could constitute a rhetorical resource to influence the actions and decisions of the colonial administration. The other literature that is of interest for this research is the one about accounting for slavery and forced labor. This trend highlights the major function of accounting in the commodification of slave labor. Accounting enables the objectification, the dehumanization, and ultimately the monetization of slaves. For example, studies about the triangular trade have shown how future slaves were transformed into commodities through merchant accounting practices. In plantation economies, accounting systems used by planters and local governments participated to the construction of slaves as productive assets. Finally, some research focusing on the period of transition following abolition of slavery highlight how accounting practices were involved in the constitution of newly freed slaves in market-driven working force. Thus, this literature has documented the central function of accounting in the commoditization process of forced labor. Our study contributes by highlighting a reverse movement of decommoditization of an initially free labor force into indentured workforce for colonial companies. I will now present in more detail the historical context of our study. The implementation of a concessionary regime was chosen as the main mode of colonization of French Equatorial Africa. 40 concessions were created and attributed to companies that had exclusive rights of agricultural, forestry, and industrial exploitation, in exchange for a fixed royalty and a part of the annual profits. These companies developed an economic model based on barter trafficking and the export of rubber and ivory collected by indigenous workers. In 1902, colonial administration decided to establish a capitation tax system to avoid workforce shortage. Each man of working age had to pay an annual tax in the form of rubber because of the absence of cash in the colony. The rubber collected by the administration was then sold to the companies at a retrocession price fixed by the administration. This price was generally lower than the price paid by companies for the rubber collected by free local workers. Due to the resistance of the local population, the imposition of this latent form of forced labor generated numerous abuses from administration and companies, for example, hostage taking or attacks on village. The sustainability of the concession companies was undermined from 1912 onwards by a collapse in world rubber prices. This episode reveals the rising competitive advantage of rubber plantations in Asia, which were able to supply larger quantities of rubber at a lower cost. Thus, the concession company's business model was challenged by this market reversal. They began a communication campaign aimed at their shareholders, the public, but also the colonial authorities. This campaign was characterized by a series of cost-price disclosures intended to reassure stakeholders and increase pressure on the colonial administration to reduce cost prices by increasing the capitation tax. And this preliminary study focuses on this specific episode. This research is based on several sources. We first mobilized the periodical Les Assemblées Générales that provided annual financial reports of the main colonial companies. It comprised the balance sheets, the income statements, and the report of the commissaire aux comptes. Moreover, a retranscription of the annual general meetings was proposed to the reader. We also refer to the cost price disclosure in economic and colonial press. And finally, we mobilize the existent historiography on colonization process in French Equatorial Africa and the role of colonial companies. Our first results reveal a process of commodification of indigenous labor based on specific accounting procedures. This process consists of setting up of market mechanisms through which workers received compensation in exchange for its freely offered work, and colonial companies benefited from the products of this work. Here, accounting played a particular role given the absence of cash in the colony. Existing literature on barter accounting provides insights to understand how specific system of accounting entries ensure trade exchange without cash. Thus, from accounting document found in the archives, historian Natalie Kokry-Widrowicz was able to calculate the monetary equivalent of the average daily wage of an indigenous worker harvesting rubber for the concessionaries companies. Our study also highlights the occurrence of a reverse mechanisms of decommodification during the collapse of world rubber prices from 1912 onwards. To reassure investors, the companies launched a vast campaign of communication based on the accounting disclosures concerning their cost prices, as well as those of their agent competitors. We have reproduced here an example of such accounting disclosure from an article published in the colonial press by Weber, the director of one of the main colonial companies at the time. The main argument supported by cost price disclosure was that the major component of the cost price of a kilogram of rubber was the share of overhead. Since these expenses were by nature incompressible, the only possible solution was to increase the volume of production to decrease the cost price. But the market mechanisms by which the indigenous workers delivered rubber to the colonial companies proved insufficient to increase the quantities delivered. So, supported by their powerful unions, heads of companies claimed the rise of the amount of the capitation tax. The aim was to increase the quantity of rubber that the natives have had to deliver to the administration, and this rubber that was then handed over to the colonial companies. The administration reacted favorably to the demands of the colonial companies. A few months later, the mercurial prices of rubber was halved and the retrocession prices was greatly reduced. In this way, to pay the capitation tax, the indigenous workers were obliged to deliver twice as much rubber to the administration, mechanically increasing the quantities exported by the colonial companies at a lower cost. It was thus announced a reduction of cost price amounted to 0.775 francs per kilogram of rubber. The arguments of the colonial companies was therefore taken up almost word for word by the administration, as shown in this extract from an article published by Merlin, then General Governor of the French Equatorial Africa. Thus, we observe a process of decommodification of labor in a configuration where the market mechanisms put in place by the capitalists proved to be insufficient to ensure a level of production that guarantees their level of profit. The rhetorical use of cost price disclosure appeared to play an important role in the implementation of such a process of labor decommodification, resulting, in our case, in a reinforcement of the forced labor regime. I would like to end this presentation with some concluding remarks. At this stage of the study, it seems to us that two potential contributions may be identified. Firstly, our works our work contributes to the literature related to accounting disclosure in colonial context. This study provides an illustration of the function of costing practices in narrative accounting disclosures, which may seem somewhat unusual given the generally confidential nature of this type of accounting information. Moreover, this case shows a particular aim of accounting disclosure by colonial companies, that of sustain a mutual influence between colonial companies' interests and colonial states' policies. Another potential contribution is related to accounting literature about forced labor regimes. While a large majority of this work illustrates the capacity of accounting to generate a process of commodification of labor, our case highlights the potential of accounting to sustain an opposite decommoditization process of labor when it fits with capitalist interests. However, this project is still at an embryonic stage and therefore has many limitations and shortcomings. First, it relies on a very limited corpus of archives at this stage, and a more extensive examination of private archives of concessionary companies and administrative archives is planned. In addition, we are aware of the need to broaden the periods studied to show that this case of commoditization and decommoditization is not an isolated episode in the history of colonial companies in French Equatorial Africa. So I'm done, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Asami, if you want to jump in now for your discussion.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Antoine, for your presentation. I hope that you hear me well. Okay, so just as I understand, we have only 10 minutes for my discussion and for questions of the attendancy. I will not share my my documents. I will send it directly to Antoine, as I know for a moment. I met him several times. And I will focus also my discussion on 2-3 points that I think are worth discussion with other attendances. First, in my opinion, the objective it's quite broad in its presentation, and it doesn't help you to choose one lens or one attack angle to sharpen more your contribution. In my opinion, your contribution it's quite large, and it doesn't help the reading of the paper, and which will be your main contribution. Also, in the literature review, the same remark. I think that the discussion, the section on accounting and the capitalism, I don't think that it will be useful for the reader, for the paper. In my opinion, it will be better to integrate the argument section on forced labor and the form of capitalism accumulation and accounting. I think integrating the two subsections and making more integrated arguments will be more useful for the paper. So here my biggest question or points of discussion. So if I understand well, the study emphasizes the significant role of accounting in the commodification of labor, which allow capitalists to transform, according to the paper, to transform individuals and their labor power into commodities that could be bought and sold in the market like any other good. So the article highlights the role of accounting practices of both private actors and government accounting tools in this commodification process, and in some cases, in the institutionalization of the slave system. The concept of the commodification of work, as you presented it, refers to the process removing labor from the market where labor becomes a commodity and is no longer subject to the forces of supply and demand. But here when I'm confused, does the fact that work is no longer commodified, as you call it, decommodified, make it dignified work or free from the market? In my opinion, it's still forced work at the service of the market and corporate competition. It's just hidden from the market. It's not escaping the market. So when you say the commodification make work and human as assets, and the surplus of work is used by capitalists, the fact that taking out this work from the markets doesn't make it decommodified. It's still commodified, but it's just outside of the market. It's still something that is not free. It's still something that it's forced. It's still something that is used without any outside of any right. So that is why I'm quite not at ease with this word decommodified. So the term decommodified is confusing, and sometimes it suggests that escaping from the markets where the human being has been commodified could be interested. And it's not the case. We understand it, but as it's theorized, decommodified, it's quite it's not helping you to put more light on what is happening for this population. So imposing a tax on the natives, without any reason is form of esclavagism. So in my opinion, we are not leaving the commodification box. We are still in it. It's another form because they consider that there is an asset there, and the colonial companies decide they don't want to buy any more their labor, so they make it work. So it's like it's not human. It's like something else. It's, okay, I can't call you a slave. I will call you a forced worker. Give me tax. Why you give me tax? So decommodification, it's not the term that helps you well to show the real face of this process. Okay. There is another point that I'm quite at ease with it. The first one is the role of the narratives accounting disclosure, because the data, what you presented, is more focused on the local, what was happening in Africa. It was happening, which was this companies doing by making people working for free or for tax. But the role of narrative accounting disclosure, I feel that it was more directed toward the company stakeholders in France to convince them to impose a new tax. So the role of narrative accounting disclosure, in my opinion, right now, is not very clear in the paper, and how it's acted. So I didn't see it very well in the paper. The second thing, for the decommodified work or this imposed work, the role of accounting, in my opinion, is not very obvious in this case, because it's not, in my opinion, central to the process of setting the capitation tax. The accounting does not reveal, in my opinion, a social or a natural object that would have escaped the control of the companies, if it was not captured or revealed by accounting. The accounting doesn't make something revealed, sorry, revealed to these companies to catch it. So the role is not of accounting, it's not so clear on the ground, but to convince the state, I agree with you, but on the ground, the role of accounting, I'm not quite convinced by it. So in my opinion, it's a question of the contempt that colonial forces have for the autochthones, the natives, and the local population, and they impose tax on them without any reason. For a last point, what I would like to learn more, about this case. I would like to learn more about Africa. I will confess that I didn't find in the paper new insights that about the colonial practice in Africa. I think these colonial practices are well known and documented everywhere of all sorts of people and countries used by colonial forces. So perhaps there is an aspect that would be very interesting for the accounting history reader. It's the role of the traditional chiefs. Traditional chiefs, how their action make the tax effective. How their traditional power make the tax effective. Because in your presentation in the paper, we see that there is first period where the tax was not effective, and the intervention of the traditional leader power make it effective. So there is something about this corruption of the local chiefs, how their local power or traditional power make the tax effective. That could be very interesting to accounting history. So I will stop there. I will send my file to Antoine directly, and let the room. Let's the rest of time for the.
Thank you so much.
Very much.
Thank you very much, Sammy.
Right, thank you so much. Antoine, I think there is 1 or 2 hands raised, even though we're pressed for time, but I'll give Professor Uwaigbe and Kriki. But Professor Uwaigbe, quickly, if you have a question or a feedback to give.
Thank you very much. I also appreciate you for such a program. I hope the candidate, Mr. Antonio, can hear me clearly. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Thank you. Mine is just a contribution to the content of the work. You see, for a research of this nature, there are some basic facts I think you should just get in line or in tune with. First of all, the process that existed in the period under considerations, they were not a free system. They were basically political, they were forceful, they were draconian. And so the issue of disclosure, just as the last speaker had just mentioned, the narrative disclosure was for the interest of the benefiting parties from the offshore of the continent of Africa. But meanwhile, for you to really appreciate the content of what you are doing, I want to advise you to really understand the traditional system that existed within the period under consideration. For some of those traditional systems that existed as at that period, it aided the system of the practices that were brought on board that also gave impetus for the system that gave rise to these processes. So I will appreciate if you can go down. And if you look at it closely, when we talk about the disclosure aspect, this disclosure has to do with making it public, making it for all interested parties. For example, in terms of market position, the strategy, the performance, and every other aspect. But because of the system that existed during that period, they were basically for the profiteering processes for benefiting parties. So it was not actually for the interest of the pool of Africa as at then. But I want to advise going further, just look at it closely and then see how you could really understand what actually transcended during those periods. For you to really do this, you have to go down to the grassroots. I know in my own country, in Nigeria, in the northern part of the country, because of the traditional system that existed that time, it gave more, it was beneficial for activities of this nature. And so we could have a lot of avalanche of issues to discuss as it relates to the issue before us. But nevertheless, I want to say thank you. And please, in addition, in your literature, try as much as possible to concentrate on literature that are related to the concept of discussion. I think if you do that, it will also give you a more latitude to express your discussion as you move on. These are just my few comments. Dr. Yinka, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Prof. Thank you for that feedback. Antion, just note all of this because I'm not sure, there's no need to respond at this point. Just keep them and then maybe you can put all of that together. Kriki?
Thank you. Thanks, Inka. Just two short comments. The one is both previous commentators mentioned this. One has to understand the history of labor in Africa through the centuries, long before colonialism. And the issue of unfree labor is not a new creation of the colonial powers. The unfree labor is a long-standing tradition. There's a major tradition of slavery in Africa long before the slavery, the extraction of slaves from Africa for use in Latin or Northern America. So one has to understand the traditional systems of labor extraction and labor use. And then the second comment is Rosenthal's theory is a bit flawed, so one has to be very careful not to perpetuate her flawed theory, because capitalism does not thrive on unfree labor. So capitalism thrives on free markets, of which labor as one commodity must also be free. So the theory of capitalism being based on unfree labor is absolutely flawed, and there's been criticism of that in the literature. And I think there is an article soon to be published in Accounting History which addresses a very critical perspective on the Rosenthal's thesis. So I suggest that you consider that very carefully. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kriki. I can just, Umesh, your hands is up. Okay, go for it.
Yeah, I'm just wondering the use of the word commodification or decommodification, because when you're using those terms, like I mean, this is a case of a forced labor. So apparently, I don't think these labors made any money, at all. So I think possibly the word commodification, I think that probably needs to be rethought, because we are using something very similar for the indentured labor in sugar plantation in Fiji, and it was a very similar kind of situation where the laborers were forced and they weren't paid enough. So we changed from commodification to social consequences or something of that nature. Because the argument is the labor were never able to accumulate wealth. So that's my view. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Umesh. Well, Anton, like I said, if you can just put all of this together, and that will form how the paper progresses. If you need more information from all the contributors, happy to ask for that, and I'm sure everybody will send you their thoughts. We are already behind time by 10 minutes, which means we'll probably forgo our break. So the second presentation, but for this presentation, there are just two of you with full paper, so I think it's worth the time to get as much comment as you can get. So the next paper is the one that's going to be presented by Philip. It's on the collapse of Ghana Airways and Nigerian Airways, a historical perspective. Philip, if you're ready, and Laura, you are the discussant for that one. So just once Philip is done, you can share your thoughts about the paper. Philip, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, excellent. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Yes, good morning or good afternoon. Thank you for giving the opportunity, Yinka, to expose the paper at this stage. It is an early draft. Still, the one I submitted and the one I'm working on now, I mean, we're working on now is already a bit different. So it's an evolving kind of story. First, just to give a context to it, when the initial data was collected, there was no kind of accounting history in mind. Okay, so this only kind of came in quite later in a process. And I can expand a bit more on that in the method session. One other thing, if I'm not sure I'm gonna go through all the slides, you know, so you can stop me when my time's run up, you know. But what I wanted to get through in here, what we wanted to get through in here is about neo-patrimonialism. So it's about, you know, it's about neo-patrimonialism, and many studies have already kind of looked at neo-patrimonialism in Africa and corruption issues, and so this paper, even though it has some kind of instances of corruption here, it's not necessarily about corruption. It's not about corruption necessarily. The other thing is looking in, and I hope that I hope I will succeed getting this through. My co-author Adiza is here, Mafi is not here, so maybe at some point, if I'm struggling, she could come in as well. Is the more the psyche, the mindset that is behind the way we do things. And in the theory part, I kind of trying to do a little bit, and especially the new development that we're putting in, trying to get this out as much as we can. So the mindset behind the way we do things, and where this kind of that's coming. And we do it most often unconsciously. And when we see in our leaders, our decision makers, it become normal way of doing things, you know, but we don't kind of often question, including our own. And honestly, I only got to reflect on things that we used to do in our childhood, and we keep doing without kind of realizing, you know, why we're doing it. And so I hope that I will be able to get this through. I hope. So this is about the collapse of two major African airlines, Nigerian Airways and Ghana Airways. And again, we're looking at neo-patrimonialism, but this kind of historical or colonial historical perspective. So for the sake of time, I may not can provide too much detail, but if there is a question, then I'm happy to give more details. This airline collapsed in 2003, that is Nigerian Airways, and the other one 2004, Ghana Airways. And to give significance to this, it's not just a company kind of going bust. You look at all the social, economic consequences, you know, including national kind of a symbol of these kind of airlines of course, in the local context. The collapse were attributed to, of course, corruption, patronage, basically neo-patrimonialism, which is, you know, I have used this myself on many occasions to try to explain some of the corruption kind of issues, both in accounting and in society at large. in this story, accounting, again, in here we look, I mean, accounting, even when it is silent, it plays a role. Even when it is silent, it's not being used. It's not being used for a reason. So accounting is either sidelined, it's not being used, or it is presented as, formal system control all in place, but not necessarily deployed to play the role that it purpose to play in the first place. So the emphasis has always been the manifestation, the consequences of neo-patrimonialism, but very little in the why, the historical kind of context, and this is what we focusing on here. Okay. In terms of, time period, of course, the story is from just the post-colonial kind of period, which is 1957 for Ghana and 1960 for Nigeria until the collapse, 2002 and 2003. But of course, there are some development, and we kind of elaborate on that later on. So as I said, the neo-patrimonial phenomenon, and of course, the impact, as we see in the collapse of airlines, often is attributed to, African way of life, African way of doing things, African, that's in most literature, that's how it has been kind of framed. But when we start kind of looking beyond, really going to the past, we realize that this phenomenon is, if it has an African connotation or an African kind of way of doing things, it has some sort of it originated from somewhere. And that is, what we kind of try to explore a bit. You look at the AK, for example, the colonial, to understand African governance, African way of life, one need to look at the colonial past. The one I like a little bit more is the marked reinvention of social formation and the enduring kind of impact and way of life until today. When talking about today, we're talking about the present day. Basically, it's not just kind of a historical kind of experience that kind of stay in the past and then it is over. We all now got independence. It's over. But it's not necessarily kind of, we need to kind of reflect on that. And he used kind of two public concepts, which is important here, of the primordial and the civic. The primordial is what we still see in many communities in Africa, traditional grouping, association, village group, a farmers group, and so on, that we still see in our communities back in the day. And the key underpinning to these communities, trust, mutuality, complementarity, togetherness. And then one will question, how come we don't see that much today, especially when we come to public realm? And this is where the second public here it makes really make sense. The public realm basically is what we now come to term as the public, the public administration, the institutions, and and in here, which has been constructed in a way by the the colonial experience, again with a way of doing things. There was a way of doing things because pre-colonial, but now the way of doing things become new. And that realm, that public is really characteristic of kind of amoral. It's characterized by amoral behavior, amoral way of doing things. As I said, if I'm running out of time, please feel free to kind of stop me. But I hope that I will. Including notion of tribalism, it doesn't mean that there was no fight between communities or between kingdom before, but the real identity of tribalism is really kind of coming through much of a colonial experience in our setting. And the key aspect of it is why, for example, jobs or getting a public service, why is it that we need to know someone? Why is it connection? Is it connection? Again, there are a lot of literature on that, going that this kind of way of doing things, it doesn't mean in the past there was not kind of care for one siblings or one from communities, but why is it so pervasive in the public realm? So that coming to the real notion of public position. How do we conceive, how people conceive a public position? The one, for example, in charge of these airlines, how did they conceive a public position? To be able to understand the way they were kind of managing the airlines, the way they're deciding on things, allocating resources and all that. One needs to, again, to understand that from kind of this conception of public position. Again, as I said, it go back to, I won't to put too much time on that, but the one that I want to kind of go through a little bit is the notion of superiority of a Western over the locals. And that is not just about, of course, it has kind of racial connotation, but it's not just about the race. It's not just about the race. The good, the service, the idea, the technology, all that come into kind of play. And I tend to, on writing this paper, kind of reflecting on this kind of way of doing things, recall some childhood experience, things that we used to do. And one particular example, which is striking again when we reflect back on it. When a kid going to school and remote village, when you run out of chalk, what do? You go to a friend or a classmate and say, "Can you give me a piece of yours?" And the trick will be, if you give it to me, I will pray for you so your mom would give a birth to a white baby. So you have a privilege of having a white sibling. If you don't, I would pray that he give a birth to a black or a dark black, and therefore you miss out on that kind of privilege in a sense. It was a thing that we tend to do. I mean, we tend to say and things without realizing that we are basically reproducing, many examples, including my own field work in Africa, where, at some point they say, if we knew you were who you are, we wouldn't kind of turn up. Basically, if we thought it was going to be a white, something like that. So that notion and that mindset that we kind of still today, including our decision makers, is something that to understand, to explain, to understand, again, need to go back to these kind of experiences, because that is not just, it didn't just stay in the past and went away. It's still kind of, and this superiority of Western advice, Western idea, Western technology, when you use it, it gives a legitimacy, because this is kind of popular conception. When you say you need an accountant, going to hire a Big Four accounting firm, or going to hire an accountant or an accounting whatever from, or getting accounting advice from outside, from the West, it gives some sort of privilege, legitimacy to this kind of, again, the purpose is to try to understand why people, decision makers, make certain decisions the way they make. They do things the way they do. And to do this, it is not just kind of, it requires a lot of work, a lot of reading, going back to, because the people themselves cannot explain. That is where the problem is. Why are you doing this? It's difficult for them to explain. And again, in our childhood when we're doing this, we couldn't explain it. We just, we just do it. Even when we grow up and we seek out everything, we just do it without kind of meaningful. So this is the frame, kind of a framing. I would call it a framing. And again, once is going back to beyond the manifestation of pattern, but going back to where we got this from, where this comes from. So the data basically, data, we started with interview. And how did we start this? It started with just something happening with NA, some kind of news coming out and problem going on. And then it was Matthew at the time, say 1996. Okay, Matthew is a management accountant. So most research is about management accounting. So I want to go and see the role of accounting information in decision making and how this came about, basically. And once I get in the field, realize that it's not just about accounting information because it has little role. In a sense, it was quite high, kind of sidelined. So when you look at the data he collected then, there was kind of a lot of political, involvement in the decision in management with little accounting kind of role. So that's where then we decide to go back in the field again to explore why. So it's not about accounting information. Now, why this political kind of intertwine between the airline, what's happening, and the management, everything that is going more kind of political than anything, kind of rationality is more political than anything else. So why? So when the field again in 2003, and after this, when they started working again, I haven't joined then, I've only joined recently, started working then, news started coming from Nigeria. Nigeria also collapsed. And kind of similar to what happened in Ghana. And so, okay, let's go and then investigate this. Maybe you could give us kind of comparative perspective. And that's how Hadiza ended up going to Nigeria. And then we look at some document, we collect some document, as well as now that we're kind of trying to make sense of it, looking into sort of historical work, history, colonialism, culture, education, and so on. So all these together kind of give us some sort of lens and a way to make sense of the data that we collected, the data, and what people were saying without being able to explain or to put it in, in a coherent way for us to understand what is going on. The key things here, some comment here, I'm not sure if this comment were for me. 4 minutes to go, okay. Okay, so to summarize, we see some patterns from the colonial, the two airlines were British colonial airlines, basically. And then when they kind of get independence, they both kind of take their part, basically. Ghana got its part, become Ghana Airways, Nigeria become Nigerian Airways. The initial management were all British. No, you need to be trained a little bit more. You haven't really kind of got what you need to be able to handle this yourself. We need to do this. In the end, it was transferred. The money was transferred to Ghana. Ghana and Nigeria. But when they start kind of having problem, who do they go to? Went back to Britain and Dutch. With some control agreement, to get this going on and, improve the management, improve the performance, everything. So when British Airways subsidiary came in, Speedwings came in, remove the senior management, take their position. And again, what we see there is mostly rent extraction. They try to restructure the airline, expand, and the expansion, of course, needs services, need new knew some airplanes and all these things were sourced from Britain and West in Amos, and they see it as very expensive. Okay, so we see this as kind of rent, in a sense, rent extraction. When they need to do they need to do an audit. Who do they went to? Again, one Big Four accounting firm come in and do the audit. See here, they have an accounting department. They have an audit department, that's audit of public institutions, including state-owned enterprises. They have local accounting firms that are competent, that could do the work, but they didn't see that they could do it. So they went to a Big Four accounting firm to do it. Even Ghana Airways, when they want thinking about revival, who do they think they could be advisor? Again, it was a Big Four accounting firm, PwC. Similar pattern in Nigeria. Similar pattern. Again, when the Dutch came, everything again replaced. Service sourcing, everything again from Dutch, Holland and the West. So that angle, that side of the story, not much kind of being said about it. And the key is, how the decision maker, because here there is no kind of corruption, they kind of going for speed wings because they want money, they want kickback, or they're going for the KLM, Dutch KLM, because they want kickback. There is no corruption underpinning. So all that is happening here is the mindset. Even though official report, they claim that there is improvement, these were all disputed. No improvement. In the case is even worse. The performance was even worse in the end. So I would probably stop here and let Laura come in and listen to her comment.
Thank you, Philip. Laura, Philip, if you can stop sharing.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think I'll do like Sami, and I will send later on, probably on Monday, my report to the authors. But I wanted to outline a few points in order to leave also to the audience the possibility to comment or have questions. First of all, it was a very well-written paper, and I think that this idea of neo-patrimonialism came through really strongly, especially from a theoretical point of view. And what I perceived is that this is very much an ideological paper that tries to push through this idea in which the neo-patrimonialism has got this hint that is ingrained in the minds of the local people about this superiority. So whenever the superiority of the Western countries is brought into place, even in the history of these two airlines, then the Western countries are simply using that to drain even more resources from the two airlines. But also I found interesting the fact that even during the colonial period, the colonialists were using tribalism tactics that were pre-colonial in order to serve their own interest. So what in my view is really missing, and this is my main concern, again, from an accounting history point of view, is the actual story of these two airlines. in a sense that, first of all, from a methodological point of view, the data collection for the Nigerian airline starts in, the data collection starts in 2008 and uses oral history to reconstruct back the management matters that conducted at the end to the demise of this airline. For the Ghana airline, the data collection, the first fieldwork was in 1996, and then a second fieldwork was done in 2003. So in terms of data collection, these two different periods should be taken into account or somehow worked better into the story. And again, from the methodological point of view, what I wasn't able to see was, in terms of managers interviewed and notes that were taken even informally, I don't understand which were the positions of those managers within the airlines, where in a sort of the structure, the organizational structure of this airline, and that would define the responsibilities and or their authorities or boundaries of activity. So what we don't know also is the type of experience, the type of background of those managers. But the most important point for me is related to the manual coding. I understand that it is a manual coding, but I noticed that throughout the results, the evidence that were given were very thin, because it was not possible to understand how this coding related to the main theoretical part and the main theoretical concept that were given. So there are 4 points that are very clearly identified, especially in the final section of this paper. One is the psychological factor that mold this superiority of the Western capacity. How this psychological aspect is identified throughout the codification of the oral history within the paper. This is one of the questions. The second question relates to the accountability, in a sense that it is said no one accounted for such a thing. If accountability is put into place, then we need to understand, if it is not accounting, which are the other accounts that allows to say there was no accountability. Because even when there is a silence in terms of the accounting, there might be some other visibility that is given throughout the accounts. And the final point is about really the accounting part that has got a marginal role. It is said for both the Nigerian and the Ghanaian airways that at some stage also the Big Four and other consulting companies were brought into place as in order to understand what was going on and so on. And it is mentioned also a specific report that the political authorities didn't want to publish, but then they were forced to publish. And in this report, actually, most of the missing accounting points were highlighted. This, in my view, is an important evidence that is lacking in the paper as a part of the evidences. So what I would like to see more is, while the theoretical part and the literature review doesn't have any sort of issue in my view, how the story of the two airlines can unravel, but unravel thanks to much less thinner evidence than the ones that have been put in there. There are other points, but I would stop here because I see already three hands up.
Thank you so much, Laura. And I think, Philip, you get all those comments in addition back to you soon. I can see Conan, Kriki, and Mariam. Conan, you go first quickly, and then I'll go to Mariam.
Fantastic. Thank you, Moses. And then thank you, Philip, for the presentation. Just a comment to add on probably
Conan, can you speak a bit louder, please?
Yeah, I was about to say
Can you
that.
hear me? Yeah,
Yeah,
sorry.
better now,
Hear
yes.
Yeah. Now, is it better now?
It is, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So, yeah, so thank you very much. And here is just a compliment to probably the work that you're doing, which I know is not kind of easy work, right? So I think you remember probably something that we call Air Afrique, right? In the
Yes.
time. So as you're studying airlines, I think that because the idea of Air Afrique was to create a Pan-African airline, right? And then this also collapsed. So probably if you think of it, I'm not saying that, you know, you don't have enough to do, but it probably, if you think of it, and you can probably have some kind of sources of information that can give you some clues on the airline industry at that moment, right? And this might really be helpful. And then as also you get into the psyche of people, I'm wondering whether using some local social sciences regarding, you know, the African perspective of how we act, how we behave. I think probably this might help. What am I saying this? Is simply because I have ongoing project with some co-authors that you guys probably know. And we use this idea of personhood developed by some African thinkers. What is it to be, philosophically speaking, an African? And what is the personality, the person of an African, and how that interacts? So the general conclusion of that literature is that actually the continent itself is a communitarian continent. So which means that we have a communitarian self and then an individual self. Our main thesis in the research that we're doing right now is that you might have a disconnect between the personal self, duties, responsibilities, accountabilities, and some communal duties, responsibilities, and accountabilities, right? Sometimes you want to serve your community more than probably you know, your paycheck job, because you are really committed to your community, right? So I think there are things out there that might help understand the in-depth psyche of Africans. And I like, you know, the approach that you're using here. I already know your work on patrimonialism, but then this angle is really promising because we really need to get into, you know, the way we process things. So this is just my contribution to, you know, to this exciting work. Thank you very
All
much.
right, thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Conan.
Can I have
Yeah.
Mariam? Philip, no worries. You don't need to respond now.
No, I'm not responding. Yeah, it's fine. Yes,
Okay,
yes.
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philip. Very great presentation. Thank you. Actually, I just wanted to share something with you when you were talking about the superiority and especially Big Four, because I thought that maybe sharing that just be helpful in the way of thinking. And that would be, for instance, once you mentioned that the idea of the Big Four being superior. And I wanted to share that they are superior even, for instance, in Western society. So like that's, I think when you just write about it, I think it's good to have this vision, like this kind of thinking that, for instance, if you say exactly the same thing, like for instance, you're in Australia, like they get like, you know, the biggest job, they get Big Four. We've got local kind of accounting firms as well. And, you know, if the bigger job and kind of like they ask for more kind of fee, the fees higher. So if you have a bigger job, probably you go with them because they got more resources, everything available for them. And it's not being seen the same way as you explain it within the like an African society. So I think it's good to have this kind of balance.
Totally, I agree with you. And here it's not Big Four is just one. I mean, it's just one of the people they went to. And in some, I mean, in many ways, I would say it's even marginal compared to the other decision that we're making. But you put all this together, right?
Yeah.
Why the mind to always go outside? Yes, why we go outside? Seek for solution from outside.
Yes.
Not what is within your reach. What is
Yeah, and the other thing I think adding to that, Laura mentioned something very interesting. I think you can use more accountability in that regard, like much better. Like when you just put that something is, for instance, it's not fair, or it's just like more. Probably, I think accountability would be a better term for some discussion than just saying that these are the same, because it's really hard. Because like, for instance, you just think, oh, Big Four, it's even like an international organization. They like even for advice, lots of like a organization go for them, and it's very common. It's nothing like a strange that from the other perspective. But I think Laura's accountability suggestion is the great suggestion. Actually, you can include and discuss it.
Thank you so much, Miriam. Kriki, you have the last say.
And all the best.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have 3 comments to make. I'll be brief. The one is these two were state-owned enterprises post decolonization. You have to address the archives of the state. There is no way you can write anything about the demise of these 2 companies without systematically consulting the archives and the accounting records of the 2 companies. That's key. Secondly, there is fairly extensive literature on state-owned enterprises which needs to be addressed. And the third point that links to what Miriam has just said is that the Big Four are not African. The Big Four are also African. If you look at the composition of the Big Four offices in each of the African countries, they represent the people of that state. So the Big Four are not Western or distant or new patrimonialism. That's not it. The Big Four are actually the people of Africa just working within the structure of that big organization. So if you look at the composition of the CEOs and the accountants of PwC in South Africa, you'll find the people of South Africa there, the same in Kenya, the same in Uganda, and so forth. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay. No, I think, Philip, sorry to cut you, but I suspect what we will do is sort of you really want to say something? Otherwise, I don't want to take it.
Go ahead.
No, if there's something you just want to say, feel free. Otherwise, I would say maybe just take the comments and then put them together to think about how you progress with them.
No, go ahead, Yinka. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. I think just because we're running, there's a comment here, Tiven often used for, okay. Right, okay, so that's not a question, Tiven, I'm sure. Are you asking a question? No.
No, I'm not asking a question, it's just a comment. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Steven. Right, so I think, thank you. Luckily, these are the 2 papers with a lot of depth, so I suspect naturally you would expect that many comments coming through. We're supposed to have like a 5-minute break, but maybe we take it. Maybe what are we in the mood for? I think we're behind time. Okay, let's just go straight to the next phase of presentation. That will be the second session. In the second session, we will be presenting mostly proposals and extended abstract. So in my mind, this will be projects that are just very much in their early stages of conceptualization, or authors have started, but are still at the point of making that clear-cut decision of how to pitch it. So that's the thing we're going to deal with. And we have the first one that will be presented by Marianne. You will present on behalf of yourself and Tini.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay, so, and this is the evolution, am I correct yet? Yeah, the evolution of providing assurance on non-financial performance information, the journey of the Auditor General of South Africa. So, okay, I will allow you now to take control, Marianne.
Thank you, Yinka. Good day, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to learn how to approach writing an article in a history journal. This would be our first attempt, and during the presentation by Professor Fowler, I already learned quite a lot. So I'm looking forward to receive any inputs and suggestions on our proposal, because that is exactly what it is at this point in time. My co-writer, she's from the Auditor General of South Africa, is unable to join us today due to other work commitments. So our topic is basically the evolution of providing assurance on non-financial performance information, the journey of the Auditor General in South Africa. And I think that already describes what we are trying to do, although it is quite a long title. So currently, and during our discussion today, I'm just going to briefly look at the following points, just provide a bit of background, then looking at what the purpose of it would be, what we are thinking in terms of how we want to approach this, how we envisage how the document what we would actually document, then briefly looking at the originality, and then provide some time for questions and inputs. So currently there's a lot of focus on sustainability reporting and providing assurance thereon. And relating to the public sector, there are currently various initiatives, debates, discussions around the world on this. So we thought this to be a very appropriate time to share the experience of the Auditor General of South Africa and the development team on the journey they took to provide assurance on non-financial information. So in South Africa, reporting against predetermined objectives, that is what it's called here, because that is how it's described in legislation, is required by various legislation and then supported by various frameworks and guidelines. So in terms of predetermined objectives, all departments, whole of government, local government needs to have predetermined objectives that's basically aligned to our National Development Plan, which in a way should be and is informed partially by Sustainable Development Goals. So the Auditor General already started with this journey, which I will call from now on audit of non-financial information, not against predetermined objectives, since 2004. So in terms of our purpose, how we see our article is to actually take the reader through the journey of the phased-in approach. And I want to highlight that because that is exactly the approach that was followed by the Auditor General. So initially, and we would expand on this in the article, it was a desktop review and then followed by gradually implementing step-by-step approaches to actually embed this in government. So it's a phased-in approach and followed by the AGSA to embed the whole concept of the audit of non-financial information in the public sector of South Africa. Now, how we propose to do this, and we've already just initially started a qualitative approach using the AGSA as a case study, and we would actually place a lot of reliance on public available documents. Now, we have quite good documents from the Auditor General, because every year they would have a strategic plan, which would be made publicly available, and that would actually stipulate what they were planning on doing in terms of the audit of non-financial information. Then at the end of each financial year, the Auditor General also issues annual general reports, and these reports then would actually, summarize the findings of this phased-in approach steps, the results, the shortcomings, the weaknesses. So that will very much form a basis of our study. Currently, we are still in the process to try and obtain permission from the Auditor General to also use internal documents, because there's a lot of internal documents that we have privy to, but that's not necessarily publicly available, and that we would need to get permission for. Then we are also planning to have semi-structured interviews with the core development team, also, subjected to us getting permission from the Auditor General. Since the process was started in 2004, we are actually planning, to cover the period from 2004 to 2022. Our plan is also to divide the time period, this time period of 18 years, into the 4 main phases and explain, what happened during each of these 4 phases. So what we would like to document at this point in time, and it's very much reflective, is the steps taken in the phased-in approach from the start to actually expressing an opinion, conclusion, or finding. But our article will start off by reflecting on relevant literature on the audit of non-financial information in the public sector. So we start off with the initial comparative study that was conducted at that time, and that informed a lot of decisions that was taken during the design and development process. And we do that by referring to the initial approaches adopted in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. The literature review also includes an analysis of studies on the audit of non-financial information in the public sector, including theoretical approaches that were adopted. Following then on the literature review, the article then expands on the actual approach that was adopted, the design and the audit procedures performed during the set period from 2004 to 2022. It also documents the reflection of the different role players, and also to demonstrate the timeline and what happened during this period. The plan is then for the next section to include some of the challenges that were experienced, as well as the enablers for the implementation, followed by a conclusion and lesson learned. The one thing the article will not do is in any way explore the feasibility and appropriateness of the decision and approach in auditing the non-financial information. At this point in time, what we need to add that's not reflected yet is also to reflect on the limitations of the study. So that would be added. In terms of originality, I think the key thing for us is to actually document the history in the development to make sure that this is not lost, because a lot of effort and I think positiveness came out of this project. At the time the project was started in 2004, very few countries in the world have implemented assurance on non-financial information, especially in the public sector. So it was very original at that point in time. And also, we believe it can serve as a reference point for further development of the audit of sustainability reports in the public sector. And in that regard, there have already been, outreaches from various bodies working on the audit of sustainability reports to the members in the Auditor General's office. So I think that could also be a good reference point for further development. And that takes me to the end of my proposal, and I will be happy to hear from Mariam now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariam, for the great presentation. Let me just, I've got some. Yeah, I think you have to stop sharing so I can share my slides. Thanks. I just put it in the discussion mode. Can you see?
It's not showing yet.
Okay.
Just try to see if you're sharing.
Okay, share.
Yes, coming up now.
Okay, so let me. I can't see myself. Okay. All right. All right. So thank you so much, Marianne, for the great presentation. Something that I want to start with is that, and I'm so glad that you mentioned it yourself about Caroline's kind of the slides, because when I was reading the articles, I noticed that probably, and after I was listening to Caroline's presentation, I noticed that that could be a great help for you guys in further development of the paper and make it to a more kind of historical paper. So that would be great, because I could see every time everything that Caroline was saying could be relevant from the theory perspective, timeline and everything. And my first suggestion would be that you go through the slides and just kind of the Caroline the slide and see what you can actually adapt from the slides from different angles. The first kind of summarizing the proposal, the purpose that you mentioned at the start, just saying that we want to actually kind of walk readers through the journey of the kind of audit general and the process. That's quite interesting. And adding to the kind of idea of history not being lost is quite interesting. But the point is to make the whole study into the next level for the quality enhancement. If you just want to publish like a high quality history paper, probably you have to tick some more boxes. I can see that you started, like, for instance, with the periodization of the phases, and you started doing that, but it was missing some information in the proposal. But I can see that you started it, but I think you have to actually go through every single step of methodology, design, and everything to make sure that the quality for each kind of aspects kind of enhance. So for example, it's probably, it feels like it at the moment that it's more descriptive. And I was thinking maybe there is a room to add a bit of more critical discussion. What is the kind of main, like, what is the story there? And then there are different ways. Probably depends on what you find about challenges or that you mentioned, or the lesson learned. Maybe you can add, for instance, appropriate literature around those areas. Maybe you can add theory around those areas, and then make it more kind of like a nice focus about that. So for periodization kind of thing, and I was thinking maybe some additional discussion or critical discussion that you can add, as Caroline also mentioned in her presentation, to see the differences between each period, highlight those changes and critically highlight them and analyze. So, but it's gonna be like up to you to see what you find and what you're gonna focus. Regarding the design, it's really actually interesting to see, and it's very valuable that you use like a mixture of the documental analysis and semi-structure interviews is very helpful. For the semi-structural interviews, to just give you some history going to interview people who been involved in that process, and if you just read the literature or papers about oral history, you get some idea how to use that as well. Literature review still could be enriched, but probably depends on what you find. You can go back and that area and you just can say, this is the literature and these are the new lessons that we learned. One book that kind of related to the South Africa. I haven't read the book in details, but because it was lots of information there, I was thinking that it's good that you read it, at least make sure that you cover it and you build on whatever is known to add to your contribution. A bit of context on non-public sector could be interesting, just as a context, where like when I was reading the proposal, I just wanted to know, even if it's just a few, like a sentences in the background, I would be interested to read about it. About the discussion, the same actually comments, what is the message of the study, but I'm so glad that you mentioned the lessons learned, but that's actually good, just because it was not clear in proposal. That's a proposal, it doesn't show, but I'm glad that you're on the right track. You want to talk about the lesson learned, and critical also analysis of data, and then get rid of that only descriptive kind of this happened, kind of add a bit of value to the discussion. So when you have like some lesson learned or some story to tell, maybe you can actually consider including theory. I see lots of like a significant trend in use of the theory in accounting history. I know lots of even on the editorial board, I know some people from my past experience that they really want to see the theory in the papers some way or around. I think Caroline mentioned many theories, and I noticed that one of that could be kind of related to your study, actor network theory. That's when you're just talking about the different actors playing roles, that sort of thing, that may be actually related to your kind of that aspect of the study. Just go through it, have a look at the theory and see if it fits. You already have introduction and background mixed, so I'm basically suggesting that it's a good idea to separate it, and that could be kind of following the journals kind of format that shows that, you know, you're writing for this specific journal, and kind of you follow some kind of unwritten guideline as well as written guideline for the journal. So selection phases, it was not clear exactly or in details that how these phases actually selected, kind of separated. So I think it would be interesting to see that as well. And the study is about public sector. I think it's good to have the public sector in title, because it's a kind of an area of research, and I think it could be good to add it in the title. It's not a big thing, and that's pretty much it. And I wish you all the best in further development of the paper. And I'm so glad I see the hands up.
Thank you so much, Mariam. I think I can see Kriti's hand up. Can you go now and just put, okay.
Thank you, Yinka. Yes, this proposal is very much in a preliminary stage, and it requires substantial depth in terms of theorization, which Miriam has now highlighted very well. Thank you for that, Miriam. I think actor network theory may be useful, but also in accounting history, there's extensive literature on regulation And I think one has to take into account that the formalization of reporting in the Auditor General's office has something to do about the regulation of accounting and accounting reporting, but both in the public and the private sector. And there is also extensive literature dealing with the sites of regulation. What is the location of the decision to regulate? And Cooper and Robson's work deal with that fairly extensively. So I think what is vital in this paper is context, historical context. Why has this office developed the way you are now exploring it? One needs to understand how the tasks of the Office of the Auditor General has developed through history. What was its role in the past and now in the period after 94? And then the reason for the changes around about 2004. One has also to take into account the King reports on accountability and responsibility, which impacted on these developments. So there will be a lot of public and official documentation on the process that you are researching. But behind the scenes, there is the motivation, the reasons for putting this in place. And that is why the historical context is so vital, and the connection between the different actors. Why has it become important for the different actors to effect these changes? So that's what I would suggest at the moment, but I must say, because it is in such a preliminary stage, it's very difficult for me really to comment in more depth, but I will be more than willing to assist if you need, if you would like to come back to me about this. I think that there's a lot of potential in this, but what we also have to take into account the role of official accounting bodies in this in these developments. That's why I say the context of regulation is a much broader theme, and in the South African context, it has a very specific meaning, and I suggest that one gives attention to that.
Thank you so much. Caroline Caudry, I think you've got your hand up.
I'm just going to, in the end, really endorse what Heike said. You've obviously got a really interesting story, Marianne, and to have someone from the Auditor General's office assisting you or working with on the topic as well is really interesting. I would be interested, and I don't know what the story is, right? So some of these comments, don't take everything that you've been told and slavishly follow it. You've got to be critical about these comments because we don't know the story. But, I think about the IPSASB, so the Public Sector, International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board, and their RPG on service performance reporting. I think about the role of INTERSAI, so the International Organization of Supreme Audit Institutions. And to be fair, 2004 was quite a long time ago, so I don't think they had something in that space. But, what were the drivers? Did you have an institutional entrepreneur or a policy entrepreneur in the way of the Auditor General? As Heike said, was it the King report? Was it? So all of those things, and to audit performance reporting, someone has to write it to start with. So it's not just, let's start doing some auditing. We have to have public sector entities that are actually producing it. We have to have staff that can do it. So there's obviously a very rich story of staff training, of entities And I can only speak from the New Zealand experience, but our poor Auditor General seems to have, we've gone through a few of them, not untimely, not generally untimely, but we've gone through a few of them that all bang their heads against the wall and say that the public sector isn't doing good enough non-financial reporting, even though in New Zealand they've been doing it for more than 30 years and have been audited all that time. So I think there's an international story, there's a local story, and there's a great, probably half a dozen articles of which this is going to be your next life story, I think. If audits, public sector audits, a fantastic topic. I'll go back to sleep now. Thank you.
Well, thanks. And that's an important advice from a standards setter herself. Thank you. Like with every other one, I don't think you need to comment now, Mariam. Just probably take the notes and then thank you. It's the two Mariam and Mariam. All right. Let's go to, I think, Leslie, you're next, if you're ready for your presentation. You've also have, it's still at the proposal stage, but Leslie, your work is looking at the South African case of the adoption of IFRS and IFRS for SMEs, a regulatory theory perspective. So just reading off what, Leslie. Hi, Leslie, can you hear me? Okay.
Yinka, is she muted?
No, I think
she
I'm here. Sorry,
okay, sorry.
Just took a bit of time to set up.
No problem. Go ahead now.
Okay. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Umesh, I must apologize. I have changed the title of the paper a bit. So this is a paper I actually wrote in 2018. And then, to be honest, I just put it aside. I wasn't sure if there was a story there or not. And then when I saw the AAFA was organizing this workshop on accounting history, I thought, well, maybe this is an opportunity to work on it. And then I also saw, Ricky, you were going to be involved, and I know you've published and written in this space. So I really thought this was a really good opportunity to move this paper along. So basically, I'm looking at the standard setting in South Africa, and I'm using regulatory theory as the lens for that view. Sorry. There we are. So I've set out the purpose and examines the influence of the accounting profession on standard setting in South Africa. And I thought it does contribute in that it's a historical account of standard setting in South Africa. And also it adds to the discourse on regulatory theories. And then I've also just set out the format of the paper. It's not complete, but I'll would like to show you what I've done, and then I would really like some feedback, whether it's focused enough, is there a story in it worth telling, and how to pitch it. So you can see I've looked at 4 sort of areas where I'm going to show how the accounting profession has influenced standard setting. 5 areas, and I've listed those 5 areas there on the slide. So firstly, I would start off with, as my background would be the regulatory theories, the need for regulation. And I'm just going to go through these quite quickly. But there are studies, for instance, public interest theory, there are studies which have looked at the various theories and they've tried to link them to standard setting. So for instance, regulatory capture theory, there have been studies where they've looked at regulations and how it has influenced standard setting in different countries. And then there's also public choice theory, and also again studies which have tried to link public choice theory to standard setting. So the research methodology would be qualitative, and then primary sources of information were minutes of the various accounting setting bodies, agenda documents, Companies Acts. And then I've also looked at other sources of information, for instance, results of SACA surveys and other literature. So I must apologize in advance because there are going to be a lot of acronyms, and I probably can't explain them all now, but obviously in the paper it would all be explained. But in South Africa, we have sort of 4 major bodies which have been involved with standard setting. So the most prominent body is SACA, which is a professional accountancy organization. It is a member of IFAC, but in actual fact in South Africa we have 12 professional accountancy organizations, but they all operate at different levels of the accounting services chain. We have an audit regulator, IRBA, and we've got our, prior to 2012, we had the Accounting Practices Board as the main standard setter, and then after the Companies Act was promulgated, we had the Financial Reporting Standards Committee set up, which became the standard setter for South Africa. So basically what the paper does is it looks at a timeline, and I'm sorry, this is really squashed up for you, of standard setting in South Africa. And then it looks, so there's an overview of the timeline. Let me just go back. So starting in 1962 and then going to 2022. And as I said, I wrote this paper, or most of it, in 2018. But the FRSC, the Financial Reporting Standards Committee, has actually been dormant for the last 4 years. So I sort of feel the fact that if I were to try and update it now, I'm not really losing out anything because nothing really has happened for the last 4 years. So again, sorry, I'm going to go back to the first list. So basically, here's an overview of how standard setting evolved in South Africa, and then the paper would sort of focus on various aspects. So for instance, in 1980, the accounting body controlled standard setting. And then 1993 to 2004, we had a harmonization project. 2005, JSE endorses IFRS for listed companies. Then we had the APB endorsing the draft IFRS for SMEs. And then we have 2011, the FRSC established. And then we've got a memorandum of understanding between SACA and the FRSC. We've got the dormancy, and then now we've got new FRSC members. So there's quite a story, I think, in there. And what I've tried to do is look at each, look at 5 aspects. So the first aspect I look at is the adoption of IFRS and how the accounting body and the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, they were influential in IFRS adoption. So in South Africa, we actually adopted the International Financial Reporting Standards before it became mandatory in terms of the Companies Act. Sorry, and I should have perhaps told you that running through this whole story, we also had corporate law reform. So we had 2 acts which came out. And only in the second act, the Companies Act of 2008, was it mandated that IFRS and IFRS for SMEs would be required. So this would be one of the stories. And so the accountancy body and the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, they were influential in IFRS adoption. And it actually fits public interest theory because the current legislation was insufficient in mandating the application of GAAP. And it also reflects or fits capture theory, where the regulator served the interests of the regulatee by mandating IFRS. So each time, sort of each event would be discussed, and then obviously references would be made to prior literature, and then also trying to link it back to which regulatory theory does it fit best. So here's another long list of dates, but those dates, some of those obviously fall in the first set of dates. And this is when South Africa adopted IFRS or IFRS for SMEs, and we adopted it when it was an ED. And I actually have written a paper on this, which has been published, just looking at this particular event. And basically this event actually fitted public interest theory. And the main beneficiary of the decision was the accounting body and IRBA, and then SAICA captured the adoption for marketing purposes. In other words, the process was captured for the benefit of their members. I'm just looking at the time. So that would be the second story. Then what happened when the FRSC was appointed? It basically had no, so this was in terms of the Companies Act. It was underfunded, to be honest. So they didn't really have the money to do any sort of what their mandate was, but their mandate was also unclear to them themselves, because they were not required to endorse or reject IFRS for IFRS for SMEs, because that is embedded in the Companies Act. So basically they were only expected to issue what they called financial reporting pronouncements, which would take into account South African circumstances and issues not specifically addressed by IFRS. And these financial reporting pronouncements would not be able to contradict IFRS or IFRS for SMEs. So the mandate was quite limited, and also without having a budget. So basically what they did was they actually entered into a MOU with the professional body. So those are just some of the aspects in the Memorandum of Association. So again, looking at this as a specific event, you know, possibly the fact that they were under budgeted, there was a lack of independence. They had to rely on the accounting professional body. So they actually got the Accounting Practices Committee to do all the secretarial work, issue discussion papers, collect comment letters, etc. So this actually sort of, to my mind, it sort of fits capture theory. In other words, the Financial Reporting Standards Council has been captured by the professional body. And then the fourth one I look at is the membership of the bodies, because prior to the FRSC being appointed, we had the Accounting Practices Board, and that was a private board, which was our standard setting body in South Africa. And I don't know if you can just quickly cast your eyes over who the membership of the APB was. And you can see it was quite a diverse membership with CIMA, SAIPA, the SA Chamber of Business, Chamber of Mines, all being part of that standard setting body. And now we have the FRSC, which is our standard setting body. And it doesn't say anything about qualifications or which industries it should represent. It just really focuses on the preparation of financial statements. But in 2022, as I said, the FRSC was dormant for quite a few years. New FRSC members were appointed, and 12 of the 16 are SAICA members, the professional body, including the chair of the council. So again, you know, there has been some criticism of this proposed membership. They noted themselves that it was important for them to be seen as independent. They were then dormant. Now they've re-established themselves, but most of them belong to the professional body. So again, this probably fits capture theory. In other words, the FRSC has been captured by the accounting profession. And then the last one I looked at, which would be the fifth event, was our the adoption of micro-GARP appointing. Again, what happened here is the FRSC, they actually almost outsourced this to the accounting professional body, but this section's not yet finished. And, you know, here my comment would be, we've got 12 other professional accounting organizations which are operating at different levels in the accounting supply chain, yet none of them were asked to be involved in a proposed standard for micro-GARP reporting. And the accounting professional body, the major one, SAICA, it's very unlikely that their members are actually involved in you know, the very small enterprises, because in South Africa we also have the situation where certain very small companies actually don't need an audit, they just need an independent review. So I think here I probably would conclude maybe there's an element of capture theory. So basically, if I were to finish this paper, it looks at the 5 areas of influence. There's signs that the accounting profession manages the process. It gives them a lot of prestige. They can advertise a lot as to what they're doing for all their members. And then, although aspects of public interest theory are present, I think the capture theory is more prevalent. And then a limitation would be that not all the processes are examined. So I've only been able to examine documents in the public domain. The APC minutes are not available to non-members. And of course, you know, you obviously don't, I wouldn't know what informal discussions go on between the members. So that's my proposed paper. I've said proposed, I did write a lot of it, but I never ever finished it. And I would really like to have some feedback as to whether it's worth finishing and yeah, anything. Thank you.
So much, Leslie. Umesh?
Leslie, if you can stop sharing, so we can.
Okay. Sorry, getting there. Stop sharing. Yeah.
Thank you, Leslie. That was a wonderful presentation. Just looking at the version of the paper, that the title was a bit different from what I have seen. So nevertheless,
Apologies for that.
that's okay. But the content was yeah, quite similar. So the paper basically aimed to examine the influence of the accounting profession on the standard setting in South Africa using a timeline of standard setting that was from 1962. So you're going from 1962 to 2022. So that's good. And Caroline earlier on mentioned in her paper that it's useful to break it into different time periods so that it becomes a nice historical paper over that period of time. The reason 1962 was chosen was because this was when the Accounting and Auditing Standard Procedure Committee were formed by the Joint Council of the Society of Chartered Accountants of South Africa. And the proposed theoretical model is the regulatory theory perspective, which is good. So the strengths of the paper or the proposal, I think it's an interesting proposal and it is very well written. The context of the topic again is timely because we haven't seen a lot of literature on IFRS for SMEs in South Africa. So that's a wonderful motivation for this work. I think the research methodology is appropriate and the expected contribution looks good. The improvements that I would suggest is the choice of theory. Why do we use regulatory theory? What is the rationale behind usage of that? And again, I think there needs to be a better justification for why this study is necessary. Why does it matter? No? And what is the overarching research question? Now, in the proposal, that doesn't seem to be coming through. So it's very important to have that question and trying to link the literature review theory and findings back to that overarching research question. I was wondering in the findings section, we see three theories and that confuses me. And these theories were public interest theories. Then we saw regulatory theory and interest group capture theory. So I'm not sure what would be the theoretical contribution, particularly when you have three different theories, and I'm not sure they may be coming from different paradigms. So I think it's important if you are using two, then maybe they're not from the same paradigm, and how do you reconcile? No, so I think the theoretical perspective needs a little bit of thinking. And my question is, how are you contributing theoretically to the research? In places, the proposal appears to be little descriptive, something Mariam said earlier, and for the other paper. And I think if you take a critical analytical perspective, that will bring more nuance to your findings. So, and I wanted to learn what are the potential gaps in the literature and how you are trying to take that further. The other thing is the role of IFRS board in the implementation of IFRS. So we did something and we published that not in 2002, was last year in Meritary Accounting Research. So I thought maybe you would like to have a look at that. And also in that paper, you have lots of recent literature references. So maybe giving some more recency to your literature as well. So probably going through that paper, looking at the reference list and bringing in some more recent literature will further strengthen your work. I think the contribution needs to be made more robust? What is the storyline? What is new? How do you answer the so what question? And were there any previous studies on South African context on standard setting? And if so, then how is this study different from the ones that's already existing? And I'm keen on learning how your study is same or different from the extant literature. And I would like to see some kind of theoretical contribution as well. At the moment, because there's seems to be a lot going on, so probably taking a more narrow focus with a key overarching question will help to make the paper more focused. So I think the important thing is to somehow narrow it down and make it more focused. So thank you very much, and I wish you all the best with your paper.
Thank you very much, Umesh. I have made some notes. Maybe again, if you wouldn't mind just emailing them to me, and then
yeah, sure.
yeah.
I'll do that. I'll get your email from Yinka and send it to you. Yeah, no worries.
Okay. Thanks very much. And
Excellent.
Vicky, I want to hear what you've got to say.
Yeah, I can see Steven's hand up. Let's take Steven.
Hello, hi Leslie, hi.
Stephen.
Perhaps firstly to say what an interesting session today. It was very, very good, and well done on getting all these colleagues, and I'm sure the experts more on regulation, Caroline and the rest as well, I'm sure comment. Leslie, I think I had a similar sort of, I think I was trying to think in terms of regulatory theory. I mean, in a sense, it's kind of, perhaps I'm wondering whether it is sufficiently, you know, helping in setting out maybe the peculiarities, and there seem to be peculiarities within the South African kind of journey. Because I mean, in a sense, regulatory, I mean, sometimes regulatory capture is presented, and I had this comment from a reviewer, it's like, oh yeah, you have this very, what's the right word? This very benign regulator, or this very innocent regulator being taken over by these very, you know, very clever accounting profession. You know, this is a sort of narrative of regulatory capture, for example. But actually, I mean, can you hear me? Okay.
We did lose you for a while.
Oh, sorry. So I don't know if I lost you. So my question was more about the regulatory capture and the fact that there is regulatory capture, and whether there's a way to perhaps explore a little bit more this idea that perhaps it isn't so much capture as in is a willing hostage, you know, in a sense that the regulator doesn't seem to be thinking that they can do their job without necessarily having this close connection. So capture is not so much a sort of outcome, but rather perhaps an idea, a strategy, if you see what I mean. That eventually, like the last case you showed, where they try to say we have to be independent, and then eventually silence, and then eventually the people who came out of it seemed to be more connected, in fact, to the accounting profession. So I'm trying to think there's some sort of a slightly more subtle or perhaps different conceptual or theoretical view beyond capture, if you see what I mean.
I like your expression, a willing hostage.
Yes, it's a kind of a willing hostage. I mean, this is the same in the case we're writing at the moment, and the reviewers did challenge our sort of idea, was that it looked, I mean, in that particular context, the regulators were simply not well capacitated. They didn't have the right training. They didn't have the right, and so they saw the accounting firm helping them more as, we need someone to help us anyway. We can't do it, and so please come and help us. So it wasn't capture in that way. So I'm not saying this is the same here. I'm not implying that, but I'm just trying to see how this could be framed or add, you know, differently, or whether you could tease out a little bit more. Is it really capture?
Yes.
Yeah, that's my. I have other points, but I think I'll leave it to others to comment.
No, thanks very much, Stephen.
Thanks, Stephen. And Kriti? I think you're on mute. Check.
Okay, sorry. Hi, Leslie. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you? Okay. I think it's a very interesting paper and an important one that needs to be completed. I will also work with you on this if you're interested. I just want to start off by saying that regulation or standard setting in South Africa did not start in 1962, but it has been part of the profession since the profession organized itself. And then in the course of many years, it was centralized. And so one has to look at the literature on the establishment of the profession in South Africa and the role of the profession and the state in that process, which is of vital importance in explaining the rollout of the standard setting phenomenon that you're addressing. So standard setting started much earlier, and it has a lot to do with the relationship between the profession and the state. Secondly, there is extensive literature in the accounting history and critical accounting fields on standard setting, which I think needs to be addressed over and above the explanation around regulation and regulatory theory, because the standard setting phenomenon is understood as part of the regulatory process. And in that respect, one has to once again consider the site of regulation, the site of decision-making on standard setting. And that site of the decision-making in the South African case has a very strong role for the state, which has a very peculiar ideological framework since 1994, and the profession. And then there was publication by Samkin and myself in 2017 on the relationship between the state and the profession, which is vital in understanding the nature of the unraveling of regulation of the profession in South Africa. So there are indeed peculiar South African contexts that play in this study that you're proposing, but there are also global and international experiences of standard setting that are relevant. So I think the two needs to be harmonized. One needs to look at the international experience of standard setting, and then the way that it manifests in South Africa to address the peculiarities of the South African context. Then my last comment is about the scope of the paper. I think at the moment, my feeling is that it is too full. I'm sorry to say that because I actually want to learn something about the rationale for the IFRS for SMEs. So it will depend on how the final manuscript looks, whether the IFRS for SMEs should be included in the paper, or whether one should work on a second paper for that. But at the moment, in your current proposal, it seems to be as if it's perhaps too extensive. But I'm reluctant to say, leave the IFRS for SMEs out. But I think we'll have to see what the final manuscript looks like. Then the last thing, you'll have to conduct interviews with people who were involved. Where you say that you don't have access to all the official material, minutes of the meetings of the relevant bodies, you don't have access to that. You'll have to try and supplement that by means of some interviews. Okay, but we can talk about it later. Thanks very much, Lydia. I think it's a very important paper. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kriti.
Thank you.
Right. Let's go to the next paper. I think, Conan, are you the one presenting for your team?
Yes. So yeah, I'll be presenting for the team, but other presenters are there too. So I'm seeing Solomon and also Dagu, but I'll be presenting mainly.
Okay.
They can, jump in.
Exactly. So go ahead. You can share your screen. Your paper is on accounting. Oh, sorry, an account of
Fantastic.
accounting regulation within Africa's global dependencies. A polycentric interpretation of accounting interfaces in Western Francophone Africa. So.
Whoa, you did it. Thank you very much. This is a long title, right?
It is, but it's fine.
Yeah. Okay, great. So thank you for the opportunity. So as Caroline said in the beginning, we are kind of new to accounting history research, and we find a really interesting opportunity here to share things that we had in the very past, but then we start having some data and having some entry point on the on the field down there in Africa and the western part of Africa. So actually this project is let's say a combination of different interests of the different co-authors that are here on the front page of the presentation. So Solomon Zori, for instance, did his PhD on IFRS adoption in Africa, and especially he kind of navigate different countries in Western Africa with a really interesting understanding. So it is the first co-author of this paper. And then we have also Eman Dagu from Côte d'Ivoire, so the Université Félix Houphouët-Boigny, who is also really versed in this thing because he's a kind of specialist on accounting in healthcare system, but he's doing different things. He's a versatile person, but he also have a really interesting, entry point to get us to have a grasp of what is going on in terms of what is it that we want to investigate. And then Serge and I started reflecting on those things regarding accounting on the continent. And we also have other projects where we are reflecting on how we can put accounting to the service of devising a robust tool for development. So development in Africa. And it's also an interest for the professional bodies. And why are we focusing on the western part of Africa? Simply because, as you may know, so a lot of countries in the western part of Africa are Francophone. So except Gambia, which is included in Senegal, Liberia, Sierra Leone, you have Ghana, and then in the far west here you have also Nigeria. But except those countries, all other countries are Francophone. And in terms of a research present, this leads me back to Caroline's presentation. If you only see 3% of publication coming from Africa, I would say Francophone is even less. But that being said, the fact that a geographical area is not studied is not sufficient to motivate a research, as we all know. So what we're trying to do here is that with different research that we have now so far and ongoing, we realize that actually this part of Africa has really specific, story regarding accounting standard adoption. So basically, from the external point of view, people might see IFRS that recently was, adopted by Côte d'Ivoire, but I think on that Zori can come later on. But what we realize is that we have a kind of, attention that is there. We have two really interesting movements. So we have the international pressure through all the international dependencies that, the continent has, and then you can see accounting as a channel to express those, pressure. Therefore, countries are kind of adopting external, accounting via colonization, via, imperialism. And but at the same time, while some countries or some parts of Africa are accepting or adopting those accounting standards, they are developing their own. This is the one thing that is missing in the literature, because oftentimes it is the adoption of the alien accounting standard that is studied, but not the effort of the local actors to really figure out their own accounting standard that is a reflection of their own struggle, or the reflection of their own perspective, or what is it that they want to, contribute to the society down there. This part is missing. So we feel like it is something that we can really discuss in this paper. So we untitled the presentation on account of accounting regulation, so part of accounting regulation, but also another keyword that is important to the title is the dependency of Africa is something that is important to understand. And then in terms of theoretical lenses, we're bringing in this idea of polycentric interpretation of how accounting comes to be at the interfaces of those global dependencies. I think it's a perspective that we haven't seen, even though we are not versed, as I said earlier, in accounting history literature. While preparing this, we did a bit of homework. We haven't seen that much in accounting history literature. So just to show the context, probably this map is a bit outdated, but it is just to give you an understanding of what is it that we're talking about. So what we want to do, we want to understand the accounting standards, so S2 standards, because it's not only IFRS that is important to us, it's also the local standards that people are having in different parts of this part of Africa. But at the same time, so what we said is that we're going to focus on Cote d'Ivoire, but in reality, Cote d'Ivoire is part of a vast, region. So we have what we call CEMAC. CEMAC is in French, is for Central, African countries. And then we have here ECOWAS for CEDEAO in French, which is the West Economic, grouping of countries. So in yellow, you have also another grouping. So what is really interesting is that we have on this map, you have three groupings. The yellow grouping, which represents a kind of, accounting framework, right? We call OADA, right? And then we have in green here an economic groupment, a first one, and then in red, another economic groupment. So it's also something that was a bit missing in some part of the literature dealing with, IFRS adoption or accounting adoption in this part of the continent, is that those regional groupings are really important because they represent some forces in terms of tension between the different standard setters. So this is just to put a bit of, understanding of the location of the story. So quickly, as you may know, so actually we don't have a lot of research in accounting on the continent, but the reality is that Africa cannot be the cradle of human without having any kind of accounting of any sort. So if you really read deep in the, you read deep in the literature, you will see that some of the authors are kind of talking about that the accounting history is rooted far in the ancient time in African context. So you can read, for instance, in the research of Bristol is located the accounting in the old days of Egypt. Some of the research by C and Tinker in 2006 was locating some, let's say, artifact of accounting within some archaeological, discovery 70,000 years old, in the region in South Africa. So there is a large history of accounting, but as also Caroline said, it's really difficult to, grab data to have this pre-colonial type of understanding of this part of the, the accounting history of the continent. So we have a rich history, but then when it comes to understanding how people count things, how people deal with how they are accountable to the action that they're doing, we always, locate ourselves in, let's say, the immediate pre-colonial period and the colonial period, because this is where we can probably have access to data. And what is important in what is it that we want to do is that we really want to understand the indigenous accounting, standard setting in confrontation of the international one. This is a really important thing. And we focus on the Francophone part, and as I said earlier, is the less studied part because we feel like that the insight that we can provide here can really complement the knowledge that we already have from the other Anglophone part of the continent, or even in the northern part, because I'm seeing my colleague Sami here who studied, Morocco and also Tunisia. So I think this can complement the understanding of things here. Great. So very quickly, in terms of historical perspective, we have this paper published by Hilaz in 15, which really depict, the global dependencies of the continent itself when it comes to accounting. So you can see in this chart here that actually you can group the African countries according to the dependencies, the accounting dependencies that they have externally. So for instance, if you take here in the red part here, most of the Francophone country here, they are linked to French, the French colonizer, right? But at the same time, not only they were using a French kind of type of accounting standard, but they did experience some local accounting standards, right? So we have OCAM, for instance, and a variant of OCAM in different countries in the same zone, for instance. So so it's really interesting to understand that people are seeing it at the Francophone part, but inside that Francophone part, we have a bit of nitty-gritty that is missing within the literature that we want to kind of, bring to the surface. So it is the same thing in the continuity of that study. We can see that this was something published in 15, and so till 92, this was kind of the configuration of the accounting, let's say, architecture of this part of Africa. And then after 2000, we can see the configuration here where there was this introduction of Cisco-ADA, right? And at that time, Cote d'Ivoire was still resisting to IFRS, but in the end, IFRS was adopted in Cote d'Ivoire. I will leave that to probably Solomon to give a bit of word on that, on the IFRS side, okay, later on. Good. Now, in terms of theoretical things, so now what we observe is that we have this resistance to the international pressure, but at the end of the day, the international standard are adopted, but at the same time we have this development of local standards. So then we're trying to understand what is the story here, what are the tension, what are the let's say the friction or the alliances between local and international standard setters to have such a complex situation, because sometimes Africa is depicted as an environment where we have institutional void and where institutions are weak. But if we have the story on this angle, you can really understand that in reality, the architecture of accounting is much more complex than what we see, on most of the literature. So what we're trying to do here is that we're bringing in, first of all, two theoretical lenses. The first one is about accounting architecture, right? So we didn't kind of, we kind of, picked up on the idea of accounting infrastructure. So for us, accounting architecture is the blueprint of accounting. What are the actors? What are the, let's say, the ideologies behind, the accounting standard that's out there? And now but it's not sufficient. Once you have an understanding of the architecture, you want to understand how, the architecture is functioning. This is where we complement this notion of accounting architecture with this idea of accounting polycentricity. So we defined accounting polycentricity as an action situation within which actors across different decision centers, they interact, they create, they mandate rules, principles, and standards with various and constrained power. So I think power struggle is really important when it comes to a standard setting, especially in the context where you have these international standards that are out there, but also local, standards. But why is it important for us to focus on accounting architecture? It is simply because we believe that thinking of the standard itself is not sufficient to understand the entire engineering of accounting, because you have accounting education that is out there, the professions, how they train, the curriculums, the training within the universities. All those parts of the accounting architecture are missing a little bit sometimes in this kind of, IFRS adoption, especially in the context of the, Francophone Africa. So we believe that not only thinking of the standard, but also thinking of the training institution, thinking of the actors that were there at the very beginning of some of the local standard, because they also miss, their voice is missing in the literature. And hopefully, thanks to Dagu, one of the second co-author of the paper, we can have access to some of the first people dealing with the plan comptable ivoirien. So this is another, standard, local standard, but that standard, I think, gave place to the Cisco WADA. So we still have three elders that are there that can tell us a story about the struggle that they went through and how they succeeded to maintain plan comptable ivoirien. But in the end, they dropped this one for Cisco WADA, and then we recently Côte d'Ivoire adopted IFRS. So just to finish on that, then, so with the combination of these two theoretical lenses, what we want to demonstrate, as I said earlier, is
just sorry to interrupt, Conan. We're just running late, so if you can wrap up, just
absolutely. So, what we're doing here is we're trying to demonstrate, the maintenance of the subjugating accounting architecture coming from the external, and then also the coexistence of, the development of an emancipating accounting. So we have four kind of questions that we're trying to answer in this proposal. So in the making of the accounting architecture, how such coexistence can help understand, the recursive construction of the spaces within which people are. So we call this the territorialization of question of our four questions. The second one is the mediating questions. How actors function within those, tension, and what is the accountability culture within the development of those contexts, and then how they are controlled. So this is a bit the story that we want to bring within this proposal. And I'm going to stop there and then taking some questions. Thank you very much. And on the IFRS adoption, Solomon can, also take the lead here. Thank you.
Thank you, Conan. Let's just get Caroline to give you her thoughts, and maybe if there's a question, then you can all comment together.
Yeah.
If you just stop sharing.
Yeah, I was going to say, could you stop sharing and I'll share mine?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. By the way, thank you, Caroline, for your feedback and the time dedicated to that.
All right. Thanks. A few things. Thanks very much for that, Conan. A few things you said there sort of clarified some of the questions I actually had and some of the feedback. Now, I think it's a really interesting thing, and having, as Yenka knows, actually talked to the guys from PAFA occasionally, it is very much a big issue in Africa. Do we need to have an international wholesale take the international standards, or is there actually a need to adapt them for local conditions, because different, and your architecture and your classification where you showed us where different countries kind of fit with different groupings made a lot of sense. So thank you very much for a very interesting extended abstract proposal. And I found it really interesting. But I do have a few suggested improvements. Some I think you probably have already done. I found your research purpose or objective kind of a bit wordy. And I actually think you really need to, and you did this in your presentation, put it in the context of the subjugating and emancipating accounting architecture. And because that is really what you're looking at, and you explained that very nicely, that really what you're trying to do is understand, as you say, the actors, and the roles in the the tensions between the subjugating and the emancipating. So I think it just needs some reworking. Research questions, I struggled to find them. But you just gave me the fourfold ones, but I think what makes good research is having very clear research questions. So you've got you had the fourfold ones based on Miller, and I can't remember whose paper, but be very, very clear in what you're actually asking, because if you get your research questions right, then it becomes much easier to explain what you're studying and explain your method and write everything afterwards. So yeah, I just think you have another look at that. Again, what motivates it, I actually said, excuse me, I've had a few talks about this, and I just think it needs to be a wee bit more clearly stated. But again, you did that in your presentation and not in the document I read. Place, you talk about it being Western Francophone Africa, but really you then say you're going to talk about a Western African country, and then you say that you're going to focus in on, now my French is really bad.
I'll help you.
Okay. To me, yeah, Côte d'Ivoire.
Yeah, Côte d'Ivoire, or you can see Ivory
Côte
Coast.
d'Ivoire, yeah. No, Ivory Coast. I was trying not to be rude and call it Ivory Coast, okay?
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, you've got a big study anyway, so why not just focus in on Ivory Coast? Yeah, because you tend to focus in on that anyway. You talk about 2 time periods, so one's 100 years and the other one's 20. I think the first period, from my experience, might be a bit long. And whether it's more got a couple of events in there, or whether it actually, normally when I'm looking at periodization, I look at the point that changes things. So there certainly looks like there's a point of change in 1993. Were there other points of changes between 83 and 93, or was it all very much the same? Because if it's all very much the same, you might only want to look at the few years before 93. And that way gives you more time to give more detail and focus on key kind of questions, because when you're writing any article, you have you can't write 20,000 words. So so think very carefully about really what you have to cover. I did, and I kind of still got a bit confused when you're presenting. You talk about accounting architecture, and then some of your slides talked about accounting infrastructure, and then you talked about accounting standards. Are they all the same, or is there slight differences between them? And if you could, and I know in the paper you'll explain what the terminology you're using. I was really very, as I said, keen on the subjugating and emancipating accounting architecture idea. And I thought the accounting polycentricity is really good. And I note that it builds on your CPA article in 2021. So a bit of consistency is great. Just sort of finishing off, it's great potential to make a contribution to academic and practical knowledge. And a couple of other things just to think about. Anglo-Saxon, we don't tend to use that term anymore because it really only refers to a specific group that settled in England in the medieval times, or pre the Norman conquest. So we tend to nowadays talk about Anglophone versus Francophone. So if you're not using actor network theory, I tend to prefer people to use individuals rather than actors, but it's just, yeah. And that's because if you're writing for an international audience, you need to be very clear and very simple in what you're talking about. Now, if I plugged actors into Google Translate for a different language, I'll get lots of different things, but individuals will tell me exactly what we're talking about. So sometimes you just got to kind of be really in it, because it is an intergestal. And as I said, I think there's a wee bit of a need to focus on your focus on the key issue you're researching. So I would, really maybe focus in on Ivory Coast and really focus in on the subjugating and emancipation of this accounting architecture. But, very interesting presentation. And as I said, good luck. And I'm sure there'll be some really interesting comments. And I think Philippe has one already.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Philippe?
Oh, yeah. Oh, thank you. Yes, very good idea, research, and thanks, Caroline. Yes, I mean, just on Caroline, I think I could see the point of focusing on Côte d'Ivoire, but at the same time, I can see the challenge of doing so because Côte d'Ivoire doesn't have an accounting system for its own. Is within a regional regulation and standard setting, both the public and the private. So it will be difficult to talk about Ivory Coast accounting system without necessarily talking about accounting in OOADA. And OOADA is even more encompassing because it's not just West Africa, it's even Central Africa. So it makes things even more complex.
But you could talk about how the regulation applies in Ivory Coast based on what's happening, the overarching regulation, which I think is what he was talking about anyway. We're focusing on Ivory Coast, but we recognize it fits within the OCAM within Western Africa. But
thank you. That's the point I was going to make.
Yes,
give a broader context, but then narrow it down to that specific country. Yes. And then my own point. I think this is very rich, and I think for an international audience, probably doesn't know much about West African or Francophone African reality. It will be very important to bring out when you see OOADA, you see there is no accounting in that. I mean, in the name, but it covers accounting. But what you see in the name is a law.
Yeah.
So basically, to give an emphasis to how accounting is conceived and applied in this context. And I think that Conan, I think that aspect needs to come out a little bit in your analysis. That's just a comment. I have no question. That's fine. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Philip. I can see Kriki, you want to go again? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Conan. I think it's a very interesting submission, and I really want to encourage you to pursue this and finish it. What I find interesting is the tension between region and specific countries. So whereas there is so little written on the history of standard setting in the rest of Africa, that this would be a very interesting contribution. But I would suggest that you, if you decide to do the paper with a focus on the Côte d'Ivoire and the overarching background of the French West African region, that you keep in mind the tension between the two. I hope that going forward, we will have more accounting academics in Africa who address this issue of standard setting and regulation in a microcosmos, say in East Africa or in some case studies in Africa, because we don't have enough of that. So yours, it seems to me as if you're going to do the regional case and specific country case study, which is fine, but there is a place for both micro studies and the overarching one. And then there's one question. You made reference to indigenous standard setting versus international standard setting. Are you referring to standard setting in the indigenous form of accounting prior to the exposure to accounting that was more common in Western countries, or is it something different? So I didn't understand that. Maybe you can just ensure that it's clarified in the final manuscript. And then, so there is a difference between accounting regulation and standard setting. So I think you have to keep that in mind and decide what it is that you're actually now going to write about. IFRS is standard setting, and one has to explain whether the decision amongst the accounting profession and the organizations and the states in Africa is about regulating profession or regulating reporting or standard setting. So what heartens me about your presentation is the issue that is very important to me in my study on business in Africa, is the fact that Africa is a very big continent, but it's not one place. It is very diverse with diverse interests, capabilities, interests, and so forth. And I think your paper illustrates that very well. And your submission on a more francophone perspective is going to be very valuable. And I think one should eventually contrast something of that with the Anglophone region. But there's still a lot of work for us to do in accounting history in Africa. But good luck on this one. I think it's a very good submission. Thanks.
Excellent. And I think with that, Vicky, it's your time to just go straight into your presentation.
Thank you, Inga.
Yeah, thanks. I think most of the comments, Kunan, for you and your team are very helpful. So you have time to kind of digest into them.
Okay, so can you see the screen?
Not yet, it's not coming. Maybe it's still.
Well, let me just go back to where I was. Yeah. Are you not seeing my screen?
It's not showing yet.
Okay. No, well, then I think I'm just going to talk to it because it's not a very extensive one. My paper is on leadership and agency in the development of accounting and the profession in Africa. And what I do is do a micro study focusing on the role of an individual and looking at the role that accounting leaders on the continent have played in the past and may be playing in the future. So the accounting profession developed in Africa from traditional systems to an international aligned profession. And the location and the site of professional development outside Africa invited opportunities of leadership and network strategies to support professional development. Individuals display leadership in establishing and nurturing an accounting profession able to serve the needs of African societies. So how has leaders used the network theory to realize visionary professional development? That's the outline of my paper. So by introduction, I start off with quotes from accountants in Britain, not being organized, not realizing the collectivity of the professional organization. And then I argue that the development of accounting profession in Africa is closely to the demands of European and imperial business, and accounting technologies to support the emerging commercial engagement with new markets develop with mutual benefits. So the paper acknowledges the critical literature on imperialism and the expansion of the British accounting profession and technology in Africa, but it argues that the leadership of a professional accountant leader served to facilitate knowledge transfer, the nurturing of networks, and the eventual foundations of a multitude of professional African accounting organizations. So the theory that I will be using is the theory on leadership in business and the development of networks that provide very interesting framework to understand the role that an individual has played. Accountancy and society ultimately engage in an enduring dynamism of mutuality emerging from and giving rise to a wider context in which it operates. The functioning of the accounting craft, initially exclusively embedded in the realm of technical capability, has acquired the general acceptance of accountancy's integration into the social. Accountancy has moved from providing information to management suited to enhance the performance of the business to elevate societal responsibility. So the social can influence the practice of accounting technology and in return engender social mobility, change, and development. Accountancy has become actively and more explicitly recognized as an instrument of social management and change. And the focus of the special issue is the role of accounting systems and how the profession of accountants emerged and interacted with African economy and society. We're also interested to show how profession and the technology developed in Africa and how it assumed its responsibility towards the economy and society. We have a duty to think deeply about these matters, since not only has the accounting profession changed the society of operation from bankruptcy to client-centrism in business and commerce, from client-centrism to social and environmental responsibility, but future society and economy mandates a firm and principled partner in advancing into the challenges of the future. So the African continent and its diverse people stand to gain from the professional leadership that the accounting professions can offer. This paper addresses a history of one individual who accepted the responsibility as an accounting leader to develop the profession in locations separate from that profession, for the sole purpose of accounting's agency in promoting a healthy, secure, and well-governed society. This paper then explores the vision and the actions of Lord Henry Benson, who dedicated himself to generate and support the development of the accounting profession and accounting leadership in Africa. This paper addresses two matters. The first is Henry Benson's personal leadership in facilitating the development of accountancy as a profession in Africa. And secondly, the networks and capacity development in societies. Lord Benson's life and work has an enduring impact on the accounting profession in general, but specifically so in the development of accounting profession in Africa. The paper will reflect not only on Benson's leadership and professionalism, but imparted a telling personal influence on the lives of several contemporary leaders of the profession, but of more significance, facilitate the development of a network of professional accountants in Africa. This is his legacy of cementing the final vital link between profession and society. Second aspect will draw on Benson's professional leadership in advancing economy and society. It is on this level that professional leadership of accountants offers the vital link to the discipline of accountancy and the accounting profession's agency towards social progress, development, and stability. So then I outline briefly the leadership theory that I will be using and network theory that I will be using in an attempt to explain how he understood leadership as structure, leadership with a very clear goal and in mind, and also leadership as communication and empathy with fellow accountants, and taking their position into account, accommodating that, and taking them with him on the course of the development of the profession. Then a very valuable theory is that of networks that operates in such a way that it really enables individuals to acquire assets, capabilities, and opportunities that would develop, that would finally develop their profession.
Sorry, quickly, did you go ahead?
Have I missed you? Have I lost you?
No, you were, I think,
Yinka?
well, we're hearing you for a while and you paused. Is that, I'm not sure, but we can hear you.
Okay, well, I can't see the screen at the moment. Let me just see. Okay, so I'll be using the network theory to explain how his agency as an accounting leader has facilitated the development of stronger networks of accounting across the continent, and the establishment also then of accounting societies. So then I do biographical studies on him, or a biographical focus on him, and then I explore his role and relationship to the emergence of networks of accounting organizations in Africa, and the qualification of people from Africa as chartered accountants, and them as chartered accountants bringing back their newly acquired capacity and developing new networks and new capacity within Africa, and eventually give rise to independent African associations of accounting. So that is my focus on the individual leadership, and I want to present that as something very different from the other submissions for this special issue. Thank you.
Caroline.
Thanks, Heike. Now, I'd have to say that I have not seen the proposal, so my comments are a little bit on the fly, but I know you've talked about Benson before, and so that rang a couple of well, I have a few chimes in my brain on that. So interesting theory, this idea of leaders and networks and the development of the profession. No doubt you have thought about the sociology of the professions. We've all read Abbott, and you talked a little bit about the expansion of jurisdiction as well as maintaining jurisdiction, which is, you know, very much a part of that. So I wasn't sure how much you're focusing on the profession as opposed to this role of the leader, but I guess they interrelate. I initially wrote down what's the data, but I think you do have some biographical data. I no doubt it's letters and biographies and stories about things that he has done. You talked a little bit about social mobility, and so I wanted to move to sort of a more critical question, which is, you know, what you talked about him or the profession enabling social mobility, and that's a big term in the UK. It's not something we use down under, but you know, where people who are of lower socioeconomic, or in the UK it would be working class, you know, become accountants and then move up into a different class in society. And I wonder what sort of social mobility was being led here. You know, what type of people were being given that social mobility? Who did he prefer or not prefer when he was building these networks? Who was left out? You know, who was excluded? And I think from my memory of you talking in Portsmouth, I think he had quite strong links into the UK. How did that impact, you know, what he actually did, or how was his family and things? So I think the networks that you talk about are really interesting, because they do give you a space to be a bit more critical about, well, here was a great man, but he wasn't perfect and he had failings, and how, you know, what impact did that have on the profession going forward, and also what impact, how can he be forgiven in a way because of the era in which he lived, you know, so the bias and things that came with his generation, as it were. I'm currently writing, not for accounting history, I'm writing something about a group of people who lived or had a lot of activity 50 years ago, and I'm trying to take myself back 50 years. I was very young then, Yinka. I was probably negative, not quite, but you know, what was society like? How did society, you know, view people and view his work? So I guess my strong message is to use the data that you've got, but to really think critically about the failings of leaders and the types of leadership that they have, and you know, where that might have worked or might not have worked, so that we can then apply this to, you know, the current day. I mean, what are our learnings for the current day on leadership or networks or the profession, I guess, would be my second challenge to you. Short and to the point.
No, thank you so much. I don't think there's any need for response now, Vicky. And without any question, maybe, okay, I think Laura has got one. Yeah, go.
Yeah, a very quick question in terms of the network that was mobilized by this leader. If that somehow included also higher education institutions or educational institution, and if so, which role was thought for those institutions in pursuing the role and constructing the role of accountants?
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Laura. Very straight to the point. Without any question, I think I'll quickly share our slide and talk through what we intend to do here. As with all the presentations today, or some of them, this is also another one in its very, very early stages. And the goal is to get really thoughts and input as to what to make it look better by the time we're done with the process. So here we go. Just double checking my screen is being shared. Okay.
Yep, all good.
All right, thank you. So the idea here is to really provide some sort of accounting or historical account of the African Accounting and Finance Association, including the ways it was established and what it's been doing. So the co-authors we're working together on this project are people who have played or continue to play active role in the association. So I'm going to talk about why that is important in the way we pitch this research, perhaps given the short period that the AAFA has existed for, it was apparent to get some sort of oral history and personal reflection in the sort of data that we would use to inform the work. And I'll talk about this shortly. But in terms of the motivation, I mean, there's been just my very early engagement with accounting history literature suggests that there's been quite a few, work out there that seem to have curated the development of accounting, and quite a few authors that are familiar with in that space, Stephen Zeff, Stevenson, quite a few more names that I've not mentioned here, but they've done a good piece of work in trying, or a body of work in that direction, in trying, to show how the development of accounting has taken place. But, without too much surprise, there isn't so much of that sort of historical account about African organizations or associations. There's been a few, but it tends to be predominantly, what we normally call the usual suspect, a few big countries, but nothing in that very spread manner. And so the idea of understanding how learned societies, which I'll talk briefly about, the AAFA falls within that big umbrella of a learned society in Africa. The idea about understanding how learned societies have emerged or how they are growing is very much absent in the accounting history literature. Well, as far as I know, but there may be some aspect of it that I'm not very familiar, but are growing still. But that's still not very surprising, given that we have also seen, even in mainstream or other areas of accounting, that Africa hasn't been getting that much of representation. And I think Caroline also mentioned that in her earlier presentation. So certainly the key motivation here is really to see what we can do. And there's a very good paper by Hopkins in 2011 where, there was this big call to kind of think about 20th century learned societies and the subsequent offsprings or descendants that will come after them, to understand really this idea of historical account from, the medieval or the past era, but still historical account of modern day history, as it's mentioned there, in understanding how those kind of societies advanced specialized knowledge. So that is a motivation for us here, given that there is really limited or nothing on the African Accounting and Finance Association. So just talking about the research goal, the aim is to provide a historical account of the events that led to the establishment of the AAFA and how it has continued to influence the development of accounting, both in terms of accounting research and accounting professionalization, or really accounting enterprise and its impact in society. So hopefully our goal would be to see if we can, document specifically what we have learned, under studying a learned society that is more continental, but with respect to African jurisdiction. And then in that light, we can bring some more contribution to the accounting history literature. In terms of the specific goals, at least there are 3 key questions that we hope we can answer with this research. Number 1 would be sort of curating and understanding the factors that led to the establishment of the AAFA. So we may look at the pre-establishment period, what really happened, what were the sort of contentions or the issues before its establishment. And since it got really strong footing in the continent, what has been going on. So that will be the second question around the influence of the AFA on accounting research and professionalization in Francophone and Anglophone Africa. And then perhaps if we find a lot of materials, the third question that we'd like to really answer is how the association continues to chart the course for a paradigm shift in accounting research, because that's something that is also emerging out of its existence. In trying to knit this together, we will certainly put up a historical perspective, whether we organize a timeline to see how all those things have changed over time, or the sequence of events that suddenly give birth one to the other. In terms of overview, the whole story is on Africa today, so there is no need talking too much about it, but generally, you know, Africa also is easily described as the mother continent, purely because it is considered to be the oldest continent with over 5 million years of existence, and is the second largest continent. So certainly just talking about why this is important, if there is a continental body that really is advancing research or accounting research in terms of African society that is multicultural with different identities, it's good to understand how that is working, because I think, or we think, Africa is very important in big global conversation. And 1.4 billion people to manage, not a very big GDP per capita, perhaps, which explains one of the things the paper Trevor and I worked on is the fact that we see a very strong correlation between GDP per capita of countries and the propensity for research in those countries to be, you know, reflected in top rank accounting journal. So perhaps it could just be a random thing that countries that have more money to throw to other economic problems can also put a lot of money on the table for research. But as well, it also reminds us of the fact that there is a bit of a marginalized voice or a marginalized context in the accounting literature, both broadly and specifically within the accounting history, which I think we can bring in. And there's a more richer context in terms of the different colonial, post-colonial histories. Philip, in his presentation, highlighted the very strong neo-patrimonial structure of most African states or countries and how those things play out in terms of governance and public policy making is also important. Now, the other thing that we know, and there is a lot of anecdotal evidence, but we need to start putting a lot of it out into sort of good empirical or good research, is the fact that there is a lot of historical culture, in fact, about Africa that is largely unknown or largely undocumented. And I think perhaps one of this research or this kind of research would be a good way to showcase some of those, or even begin to motivate additional research in that direction. So we start off by looking at this whole big notion of learned societies. And in principle, it's a bit just my early or our early engagement with the literature. It's quite also a very broad area to define or to contextualize, but there's a very succinct, or will I say brief way Hopkins put it, which certainly reflects an umbrella term for any organization or association that is more involved in the exchange of knowledge and the dissemination of that knowledge. So whether it's through research or through engagement and interaction, as we will come to talk about from the Renaissance era to Enlightenment era and today to modernity, the notion of learned society seems to have changed over time. But the overall intention or the overall aim of organizations that are classified as learned societies remain the same. They're set out to specifically provide and disseminate knowledge for a particular discipline or a group of people. So in modern context, the modern LS or modern learned societies exist to promote academic discipline or sub-disciplines, more or less in terms of building research or new insight. And the goal is to really inform and help members develop capacity. And I think if we look at it from that perspective, then the AFA really fits into that position of a learned society. Interestingly, and I think a lot of my co-authors are here who are also big influential players in the AFA history and ongoing progress. It's interesting that the AAFA itself really has never described itself as a learned society. You know, even in the charter, in the establishing documents, I think we come in as perhaps non-governmental. No, we come in as either charities. Stephen, you give me that name. There's a right term we used in our article of incorporation.
I think we said not for profit.
Not for profit, yeah. We use that terminology. But looking at it more broadly, actually, the AFA itself, and even in its establishing charter, would be more suitably described as a learned society. And we think this may even be a good chance to sort of reset that conceptualization of how the AFA sees itself. So, but Hopkins provides a bit of very classic characteristics or features of how we could easily identify a learned society. And here are some of the things. Number one, such an organization is set out to facilitate the exchange and network of members through meetings and conferences, which we pretty much do. Publishing journals and book series. The AFA is very much at the very early stage, but it has just commissioned its own in-house journal and is beginning to think about that. Award of prizes and bursary. The AFA has been involved in providing or sort of facilitating funding of research in the continent, which is supported by other stakeholders, including the World Bank, and provide educational and developmental opportunities. And I think just looking at all of those things, they tick the box for really where the AAFA sits as an organization. Now, in terms of learned societies, the history of the societies that are classified as learned society has got three big dividing periods, from the Renaissance period to modernity. And I won't go too much into that, but the 15th century learned societies really started as a very loose, casual social gathering of intellectuals or people considered then to be of sort of more intellectual leaning, but they don't really do, it's not a gathering for sort of empirical or any big research activity. It could be to have a discussion about things from arts, music, and even to warfare. But gradually, you know, moving into the Enlightenment era, there was this appetite for more scientific thinking. And then that became, you know, the dividing line. And gradually, the Enlightenment era sort of built more structure around what learned societies could be defined as, including sort of more formalized membership. And at some point, it became exclusive to a particular group and subscriptions kicked in and all the rest of it. But moving, if we fast forward to the 18th and 19th century, universities started building, you know, a strong sort of competition, if we want to put it in that way, with respect to disseminating knowledge. And that became a bit of a problem for those societies that classified themselves as learned societies, because most learned societies were more or less, they bring their colleagues or bring their members together to create knowledge, but don't necessarily, you know, teach or disseminate it in the way that it is done today. And then the universities coming in created that push. And what that led to was modern day learned societies started really finding ways to disseminate their own research. And that led to things like book series, or newsletters, and gradually almost all big learned societies today will have their journal or at least one medium through which they disseminate knowledge, because that tension also created the opportunity for them to evolve. So just bringing it to more practical terms, in terms of accounting and the societies that we can classify as learned societies, interestingly, not many of these societies easily call themselves as that, but if I rely on that insight from Hopkins 2011, you will see that most of these associations tick the box. The AAA is perhaps one of the oldest, established in 1916. Most of all this association, changed over time. And that's another interesting thing. We're probably going to look at whether we, have a timeline and cutoff, or it depends on how wide we go. But again, we're looking at only AAFA, but it's perhaps important to just kind of give a sort of hint or a comparative view as to all these other associations. However, I'm also not very sure whether we should take this risk, because perhaps it may make the project a very big one and an endless pursuit. But a couple of examples exist. We've got Accounting and Finance Association of Australia and New Zealand. British Accounting Association has got a lot of rich history, and the European Accounting Association as well, having a special issue that was commissioned at its 25th year anniversary, was also very rich data. It's interesting that all of these associations have something curated about them, but the AFA doesn't have it, or doesn't have anything, and we thought it's important. Why? Because the AFO is also growing and it's making strides. It's important we sort of put something down on paper. So contextually, we will focus on the African Accounting and Finance Association, and just making it a short summary of the association. AFA was born out of the need to sort of find solution to the many problems affecting Africa. And it wasn't just the thinking of only Africans. There was quite a lot of collaborative efforts between Africans in Africa and Africans in diaspora, and even completely non-Africans, in trying to find something that will sort of bring accounting academics in the continent and sort of build that strong association that we currently have, or that is still growing. So in terms of its establishing date, there's no I think we put 2011 as the establishment, but 2011 was the first conference. So this is also a good time to go back into the history and look at really at what point was a fully formed association established. I remember as early as 2010, we were already talking about or having those early conversations in Ghana then, but the first conference, 2011, was what really remains the landmark launching of the association. But a lot of players, and that is why the list of the co-authors on the paper is very important, because everybody would have had one role or the other to play. In terms of the research method, at this point, the idea is to go atheoretical and just put up a chronological historical account based on traditional history approach of what has happened. And to do that, given the short period that the AFA has existed for, we may not have too many archival data. There is a couple, but not many. So to execute this research, a combination of different data methods will be applied. The first one really would be sort of applying some sort of archival or relying on some sort of archival data. Well, there's quite a few ways to get this. We will try to touch base with the players who were very much instrumental to the early starting period to sort of see what sort of communications they still have in record or within their record, whether they were emails or letters or even minutes and newsletters of the association in the early days. That's also a very important way of collecting data. And this is very much traditional counting history approach. The other thing we'll be doing is really relying on oral history. Now, the reason we won't take the path for oral history is because there's not been so much written already. There's really nothing written officially that I'm aware of, and I've got other people in the room who can correct. There could be a few things here and there, but they're more in the form of maybe a short piece or something, but really having a well-documented, curated history of the AEFA, we don't have that. So we will have to rely on key players, and Theresa Hammond did put out with Zika in 1996, talked about the need for really talking to players or really bringing in the lived experience of actors in accounting history. And I think really pursuing that path of oral history is also very important in this work. So that's second method. The third method would actually be self-reflection, because all of us who are authors on the paper have been very instrumental one way or the other. So it's really going to be interesting to see how we sort of have this triangulation. And that's another thing I really would like to hear your thoughts about. How difficult or how practicable will this be? Having the triangulation of looking at the archival historical information, interviewing a few people to get, their oral account of what happened or sort of their experiences through the journey, and then having reflection of authors, because we are now, we have to be playing two roles. At one point, we're the researchers, and another point, we're served the unit of analysis to be, to provide insight into the work. So happy to hear really what is doable and what is not, especially that we have well-experienced accounting historians in the room. So proposed contribution, this will be timely in terms of really documenting new insights on modern learned societies. I think the call there by Hopkins and all the other authors writing on learned society is the need to also look at the modern history. There's been huge, and Stephen Zeff, I think Parker as well in 1997, they all sort of provide accounts of players or people who have contributed to the history, but from a very, real historical old path. But now let's see, the pre-20th century accounts of accounting development and growth. But there's also this call to think about or account for what is perhaps classified as the modern accounting history of these learned societies. And also we think this will be very good in providing the first historical account of the African Accounting and Finance Association. And I hope this is doable, and I hope this is something that we can probably, I've not read, and I won't be able to say I have knowledge of all the accounting history papers, but I'm not sure I've seen any paper or that many papers that have tried to combine multiple data sources. Perhaps it's there, but I've not seen it. But who knows? Maybe this could be something also we bring to the literature, how we triangulate the self-reflection, the oral history, and the archival data we're going to use. And that's all from me and from us. Perhaps we welcome your comments and suggestions. Caroline, I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you very much, Yinka. I have nothing except my voice. So I guess for the audience, I shared a story with Yinka that as an executive office holder, in fact, funnily enough, the treasurer in an American learned society, at my AGM last year, I had someone who wanted to know why the accounts looked like they did because they were different from the Learned Society that she was part of. And, you know, so I think the choice of structure vis-a-vis some other options and the rise of places like the American Council of Learned Societies and things it probably makes the term Learned Society more US based than what we might, as you say, we have things like EAA and BAFA and AFANS that we don't think of them as such. So I think you've raised the fact that in this area there isn't a lot of literature, and the literature that is there focuses on different activities. So you talked about publishing. Now, many learned societies make a lot of their money from publishing as well as membership. So, you know, that comes down to structures and things. And of course, that is a changing situation in today's world with open access and things. And so that is something that is perhaps under attack. Other people, you say Hopkins looks at learning and education and so on. So it's not just the academics, but it's also how the profession is going to be pushed. And I think that what you, the way you've talked about your proposal is neither of those things, but it's really an organizational history. And so it's an important dual project, both a history of the organization, even though it's still quite young, and to link into the Learned Society literature and add to that scarce literature and to really bring out this idea of learned societies. Now, William Lubinau wrote a book called Only Connect, which was about learned societies in 19th century Britain. I don't know if that's one that you've come across, but that might be interesting. And it's an example of the social processes of an organization, of a learned society. And I think that you are actually looking at those social processes. And when I look at your 3 questions that you said right at the very beginning of this, I would like to take a leaf from my